I'm really sorry that this video is being uploaded late this week, but there are 3 bits of good news that comes off the back of this. The first piece of good news is that I'm going to be breaking down the entire UFC Mexico card in this video. So if there's a particular fight that interests you, don't worry, we're going to be taking a deep dive into every single matchup from a betting perspective. Hopefully you'll be able to use this information to make better betting decisions on Saturday night. The second piece of good news is that there are a bunch of good bets on this card which I'm going to be sharing with you. So hopefully you'll be able to make a bit of extra cash. We've been on quite the run. We made a small loss last weekend, but outside of that we've been doing real good. So hopefully we can bounce back with a win this weekend. You can make some extra cash and we can lock in some great value bets, win or lose, that we know are going to be plus EV. The third piece of good news is that I'm already halfway through researching UFC 326 next week, headlined by Max Holloway, Charles Oliveira, and that's the reason why this upload is late. Next week's card, the UFC 326 card, is so good for betting that I thought, you know what, instead of spending time getting breakdown videos out for this week's card, I'm going to prioritize researching next week's card to get in on some bets before the odds move against me. So if you want me to drop a UFC 326 breakdown video quickly before the odds start to decline on fighters that I think are very good bets, hit the like button below. And as soon as this video gets 100 likes, I'm talking the second it gets 100 likes, doesn't matter if it's today, tomorrow, the weekend, Monday, whenever it is, hit the like button. As soon as we get 100 likes, I'll drop the UFC 326 breakdown video on the YouTubes, where we've got some real, and I'm talking real rock solid bets. I think the only super rock solid bet we've had so far this year was Rizvan Kunaev to beat Jailton Almeida. That's the only bet I felt super confident in. A lot of the other bets have been kind of like flyers on risky underdogs, but we've won the majority of them, right? We've got some more flyers on some risky underdogs on this card, but those are the type of bets we perform well on. That's what we shoot for, right? Don't want to be betting the chalky chalk in the chaotic wild sport like MMA when guys go into the cage to engage in a fight to the death. We don't want to be betting those big heavy chalky favourites. We go for that even money odds range. We go for the underdogs and we perform great on those type of bets long term. So speaking of long term, you can see that over the long term we perform incredibly well live betting on the UFC. You can see my results dating back over the last 10 years, and we make a profit on 73% of months, which is unheard of. This is one of the greatest sports betting profitability charts you will ever see, and if you watch every UFC event live or most UFC event lives, you're essentially getting paid to watch the sport you love. Now, when I talk about live betting on the UFC in these videos and I read your YouTube comments, there are a lot of misconceptions over how live betting on the UFC works and how someone like me is able to help someone like you make a lot of money betting on this sport. I see a lot of concerns over kind of streaming issues where, you know, you guys are well aware that if you're watching a stream or a broadcast and it's 30 seconds to a minute behind the live action, you're going to be way behind what's actually going on in the octagon, and therefore, you know, at big risk of betting on fighters who may be struggling that you haven't seen them struggle yet because you're so far behind the action, right? That's a big concern I see repeated in the comments. But when you join my live betting group, you don't have to worry about that because I've got the closest thing you can get to a real-time broadcast. So the way my service works is I watch the exact same broadcast as the betting sites, but I can think faster than the betting sites because I understand the sport on a much deeper level than they do. And so as the odds are moving, as a fight's taking place and the live betting odds are going up and down, I'm seeing the exact same thing that the bookies are seeing, and I can lock in great value bets before the odds react to the action in the octagon. And now you're probably wondering, well, how does that help me? Because if I can't watch that broadcast, how do I place the live bets? How do I make money from that? Well, as you can see, not only do I have a sub 1 second audio feed where I provide you commentary and let you know exactly what's happening in the fight, but I also let you know the specific bets you should place in order to make a lot of money betting this sport. And as you can see, we make a profit on the vast majority of UFC events and almost every month of the year. But you don't have to listen to the commentary if you don't want to. The problem with the commentary is that there's going to be spoilers. I'm going to be commentating the fight from a betting point of view, but I'm probably going to be 30 seconds to 60 seconds ahead of your broadcast. So you're going to be watching stuff happen on your stream while I'm going to be talking about what's happening in the future. We all love this sport. I understand how that ruins the viewing experience. So I came up with a solution. We actually have real-time notifications, which are the closest thing you can get to real-time on the planet. Faster than Discord, faster than Telegram. It's a completely custom system that I've built from the ground up. I've got 10 years of experience doing this. I know what makes a good notification system for something like live betting on the UFC. So anywhere in the world, you can receive an audio notification, just like a bing, 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 alerting you to a live bet. Anywhere in the world with just 10 to 15 seconds or 10 to 15 milliseconds of latency. So as soon as I identify a live bet in a fight, I press the button. You can see who to bet, how much to bet on them. You can be watching the fights. You don't have to listen to any commentary. There's no spoilers. You just get a notification. You go place the bet. You continue watching the fight. And then a few minutes later, 5, 10, 15 minutes later, more often than not, you'll be counting your profits. And I say more often than not because, as you can see, our record for betting this sport is absolutely phenomenal. And if you were to join us now, it's probably a pretty good time to join us because, as you can see, we've flatlined a little bit here and we've been on a dip. Now we're grinding our way back up. You can see this beautiful little uptrend here that we're forming. And if you look back through our history, whenever we hit like a break-even period or a little dip here, 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 every single time we do that, we go on a big winning run. Little dip, huge 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 winning run. And what's interesting, you'll probably notice this dip here is not like any other dip we've ever had. It's quite a big one. It's not big actually. The max drawdown was only 15 units. It was nothing. But this dip here lasted longer than all the other dips. The reason why this dip lasted longer than all the other dips is I actually lost my real-time broadcast for just over a year. And you can see how much that impacted my profitability. We were still able to grind out profits, but it was far more difficult. So those of you saying you don't want to join the live betting group, you don't live bet on the UFC because your broadcast is delayed, I completely get it. Take it from a guy that's made a living live betting on the sport for almost 15 years. If you don't have that real-time broadcast, it is extremely difficult to make a profit. You can do it, and I've proven you can do it, but it's very, very, very difficult. Way more difficult than if you have the real-time broadcast, which I have. And you can see we're on a nice little uptrend since we fixed the broadcast situation. So if you watch every UFC event live and you bet at least $100 per fight, the membership's going to pay for itself and you'll basically earn money watching the sport you love. We should earn 30 to 40 units of profit this year, no problem. We made 17 units of profit last year with the delay issues to the stream plaguing us for like the first 6 months of 2025. We were still able to make a profit. And you can see we fixed the latency issues somewhere around here. And then boom, been on a nice run ever since. So you know if you come back in a year, this profitability chart is going to be up here somewhere. And we're going to just keep grinding, keep making money most events. And I just want to keep talking about this because I'm not going to be around forever. And the world is crazy right now. You just saw, you just saw the former creator of Twitter lay off 40% of his workforce like that. AI is taking jobs. Cost of living's gone crazy. It's more expensive than ever before just to pay for rent and food and just to live. And now we're all worried about, our business being in trouble or, AI taking our jobs. Everyone needs multiple sources of income these days, right? You can't afford to just rely on one thing. If you're live betting the UFC every weekend anyway, this is a no-brainer. The max drawdown in 10 years is minus 15 units, and it's this tiny little scratch here, right? Where we went from like 5, 7, 8 down to like 5, 6 foot. It's the biggest nothing burger ever. If you bet at least $100 per fight and you watch the majority of UFC events, this really is a no-brainer, guys. And there's a reason why I've been around for 10 years in this space. And there's a reason why I've been making YouTube videos for like 6 or 7 years. The reason why I'm still here turning up every week is because when guys come and they live bet with me, they see the power, they see the magic, and they stick with me for years. And I've been doing this a very, very long time. I'm very good at it. I'm the best in the world at it. And I would love you to join my team. Love you to come join the group. And we can have great vibes, great times, make some money together every Saturday night. And have a brilliant 2026 in a very scary, very crazy, very uncertain world where everyone I speak to, no matter how much money they're earning or what they do for a living or what walk of life they come from, everyone is stressed about money, everyone is stressed about the future, everyone is stressed about AI and robots taking their job and destroying their businesses. But you know what Uncle Dana once said, as much as there's a lot I don't like about Dana, Dana once said, famously said a very long time ago, it's fighting, people get it, people like it, it's always going to be popular, and it ain't going nowhere. So at the end of the day, it's going to be a very, very long time before the robots and AI can watch a fight and interpret what's going to happen faster than me. Very long time before they'll reach the level I'm at. And that gives us a huge edge for at least maybe another 3, 4, 5 years, right? So make hay while the sun shines. Let's make as much money as we possibly can before the robots are able to live bet on the UFC better than us, and it will come. It will come. The AI is obviously brilliant at analysing pictures and images and video. So it will come. But it ain't here yet. So before it gets here, let's make as much money as humanly possible. And hopefully I'll see you in my live betting group on Saturday night. Because, yeah, the more the merrier. And you know what? Pretty soon, I think things are going to get pretty good on live betting. That's all I've got to say about that. Just come join the team. If you don't like it, obviously you can leave, and nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? If you don't take gambles and you don't try stuff, how will you ever know? Come give it a try, see how the magic happens. And one of the ways in which this magic happens, or the main way, I'll let you into my secret sauce, you know what I'm saying? The main way that the magic happens, the reason how we're able to make a profit almost every month of the year, this is ridiculous, 73% the months of the year, it's absurd, but the way we're able to do it is through hard work. When people think about professional gamblers, they think about, you know, annoying people that have an easy life, that walk into a casino in a fancy suit with a suitcase full of money, or, you know, just go to the sports book and bet hundreds of thousands on sports, and their life's easy and it's all glamorous and it's all amazing and it's all about booms and bangs and easy money and all this really cringy shit people post on Instagram, booming and banging winners and everybody makes money betting sports. And it's fucking hard, actually. It's fucking hard making a profit every year betting on sports. I barely leave my house and I put 20 to 30 hours of research into researching these fights every single week. And I've been doing that for like 15 years now. So, yes, we're amazing at live betting the sport and I make a profit almost every month of the year, but it's through hard work. And the reason why I'm able to talk to you now for at least an hour in great depth about every single fighter on this card with a pretty high degree of accuracy, reason how I'm able to do that is because I've spent so much time researching these fights. And it's this research that's going to help us make some money on Saturday night in the live betting group. Because remember what I said earlier on, how I'm able to predict what will happen in the fight before the live betting odds move. The way I'm able to do that is that I spend tons of time researching every fighter on every card, so that before things happen in fights, I can think back to what's happened in past fights between the two fighters competing. That helps me predict what will happen as the fight progresses. So if Wes Schultz has performed in a certain way in rounds 2 and 3 of his past fights, I'm going to know before he gets the second and third round of his fight this weekend against Bunes how he's likely. Did I just say penis? Sorry, Damian. I just called Damian a penis. Sorry about that. We'll just call him Damian. We'll keep it clean, because if ever I bump into Damian, I don't want him to beat my ass. He looks very scary. But yeah, the reason why we're able to perform so well on live betting over such a long period of time, quite simply, I know exactly how Wes Schultz is going to perform in rounds 2 and 3 because I've watched a bunch of footage on him. And so, actually, he's not the best example because he hasn't fought too many decisions. He hasn't gone past the first round very often, so that's a bad example. But you get my point. Let's think of a better example. Francis Marshall is a much better example. If this fight goes in the second and third round, I'm going to know exactly how Silva usually looks, exactly how Marshall usually looks. And so while everyone live betting this sport is, you know, just betting on the action in the moment, and you're seeing the live odds go bing, 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 bing all over the place, I know what a good value bet is because I know how both fighters are going to look in rounds 2 and 3. So I'm not betting on in the moment. I'm predicting what's going to happen as the fight progresses. And I can visualize what's going to happen in rounds 2 and 3 as the fight progresses based on the strengths and weaknesses of both fighters. So that gives you a little bit of insight. And I thought I would use a video like this as an opportunity to give you that additional insight into my bread and butter, what I do for a living, live betting on the UFC. It's what I do best. It's pretty much the only thing in life I do well, right? So I hope the AI doesn't get really good at analyzing fight footage and live betting the sport anytime soon. So I'm fucking screwed if that happens, but I'm sure many of you are feeling like you're pretty screwed also with all the amazing things that AI can do these days that we probably spent our whole life working towards. Wouldn't want to be an accountant or a lawyer right now, I can tell you that for free. So join the live betting group, you won't be disappointed. And now, should we just break down a fight? Should we start off with Damian Bunes? I'm just going to call him Damian. Let's not go down that road. He's fighting Wesley Schultz. So, this is one of the very few fights on the card which doesn't actually consist of a Mexican, which is nice. If we take a look at the fighter comparison, we can see that Damian, I almost called him a penis again, Damian is 23 years old compared to Schultz, who's 29. So age isn't really an issue in this one. You can see they're both about the same age. And the stats aren't too meaningful in this one. We won't focus on the stats just simply because if we look at Schultz's record, he's only had one fight under the Zuffa banner. And that was a fight that ended in less than 2 minutes. And then a fight here against Mansur Abdulmalik, which ended in about 9 minutes. So only 2 fights contributing to those stats. And then Damian, same sort of story really. He's had 1 fight on the Contender Series, and that is about it. Now, this isn't the easiest type of fight to predict because there's not tons of footage on these two going deep. So a few moments ago I spoke about how our edge in live betting is just doing a ton of research on both fighters and understanding how they match up as the fight progresses and being able to visualize how they match up as the fight progresses. It's more difficult with a fight like this because if we look at Damian's record, we can see that the vast majority of his fights have ended in round 1. He's been past round 1 a couple times, like once there, once there. But outside of that, it's all a bunch of first round finishes. He's never been to a decision. So that makes it difficult to predict how Damian's going to look as the fight progresses. Remember I said a few moments ago, one of my superpowers live betting on this sport, why we make so much money live betting on this sport over the long term, is we're able to visualize how fighters are going to look in rounds 2 and 3 and then predict how the fight is going to play out. So while everyone else is betting on the action in the moment in live betting, we're predicting how the fight is going to play out in the future. That's where our edge is. You can't do that with a guy like Damian because he has never really been outside of the first round. And if we look at Schultz's record, similar kind of story really. He has been to a decision, but he hasn't been to a decision in over 3 years now. And so impossible to know how much he has improved since then. His fight against Abdulmalik did go deep into round 2, was a bit of a war, bit of grappling, bit of striking. So we got a good look at him. But even then, that fight was 2 years ago. One thing that is really important to consider in a fight like this, we're going to be mentioning it a lot in these breakdowns this week. So obviously this fight is taking place in Mexico City at high altitude, and with neither of these guys having much experience going past the first round, obviously the shock of fighting at high altitude is going to be pretty difficult for these guys. I was actually doing some research on the impact of high altitude on the body, because this is something we've talked about for a decade when it comes to these fights. And, you know, we see fighters that usually have pretty good cardio look terrible when they fight at high altitude. So I was doing some actually scientific research using AI on the effects of competing at high altitude on the body. Actually, if you remember on my website, I'm going to be sending out an email, kind of like a case study about the impact of high altitude on fighters when they compete in Mexico City. But I'll give you the too long didn't read version right now. Basically, the best thing you can do to try and mitigate the negative impact of fighting at high altitude is to go and just live and train in the high altitude climate for like a month, so your body can kind of adjust. If you can't do that, the best thing you can do is just turn up on the day. Because for some reason I don't really understand it. I'll dive in deeper to it for the case study I'm going to send out. So if you want to receive that case study, just go to my account, go to my website. If you click the upgrade button, you can actually, if you're not a member of my website, you can actually just sign up for free. As soon as you sign up for free, you will basically go on the mailing list, and then you will receive all my kind of gems of information I drop on a weekly basis. So if you want that case study, sign up for a free account. If you're watching this video on my website, obviously you're already going to get that email. You might have already read it. But basically, I don't understand how it works. I'll dig more into the science when I write that report, that case study. If you turn up on the day of the fight, for some reason the impacts of competing at high altitude don't affect you as much. The worst thing you can do is apparently go to the high altitude area 3 to 10 days before you're competing, because then it like proper kicks you in the dick apparently. So if you think about it, that's a nightmare for fighters who haven't prepped for altitude, because obviously, you know, they're arriving for their fight around Tuesday before the event, which is like the sweet spot of when the high altitude punches you in the dick the hardest. So cardio can be a big factor in a matchup like this, and it's very difficult with neither of them being outside the first round very much to know how much it's going to impact either of them. So Penis, I've called him Penis again. I'm so sorry I called him Penis again. Damian is a very explosive, powerful, athletic guy that relies a lot on explosive energy and athleticism, and he fights at a high pace and he's very aggressive. Wesley Schultz is a little bit flatter. He's faced a very similar style to Damian actually when he fought Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik obviously very aggressive, very physically imposing, very powerful. Damian not as much so as Abdul Malik, but in the same ballpark. He lives on the same street. Wesley did slow down quite a bit in the second round of that Abdul Malik fight, but there's two possible explanations for that. Three actually. First could have been an adrenaline dump from fighting on such a big stage like the Contender Series and all the opportunity that comes with that. The second thing could have been the fight was contested at a really high pace. Abdul Malik turned it into a war. The third being Schultz. Who knows how much time he had to prepare for that fight. A lot of guys on the Contender Series coming on just like 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 weeks notice, but rarely more than that. So maybe he wasn't in the best shape. Maybe he will be for this weekend. Maybe that'll be offset by the high altitude climate. Who the fuck knows? But based on past performances, I understand why Damian's the favourite. He's more technically skilled. He's more athletic. He's more physically imposing. There's a real flatness to Wesley. He's very flat on the feet, doesn't have too much power in his hands, bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. Not particularly great on the ground either. A little bit weak off his back. He's tough, he's scrappy. His cardio against Abdul Malik was a bit of a red flag, but that might have just been a short notice thing. Cardio might look a lot better. I mean, it won't look better in Mexico City, but it might look better than Damian's, because you don't know anything about Damian's cardio, because he's killed pretty much everyone in the first round, so we don't know what he's about. So yeah, this is one of those fights, too many unknowns, too many uncertainties. It's a great fight for live betting. Hopefully we can make some money live betting this one, but pre-fight, not a chance, absolutely dead. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Eric Silva versus Francis Marshall. And this is a fight where the odds feel very wide, and you're going to hear me mention this a lot when breaking down the fights this week, because there are so many heavy favourites on this card. So obviously this is a sports betting channel, right? So our primary goal when breaking down these fights isn't to talk a lot about who's most likely to win. Is to talk about how you should approach the fight from a betting point of view. It's kind of like a strategy guide for betting these fights, right? And I always say you've got to let the odds do the work for you. So with a matchup like this, as much as I love Francis Marshall and I think he's brilliant, as a 1.13 favourite, which is minus 776 for an implied probability of almost 90%, there's just no way you can consider betting him, because in order to get any value on him at all, you've got to give him like a 95% chance of winning, which is impossible in a sport as chaotic and crazy as MMA. So the main part of this breakdown is going to focus on Eric Silva, not because I think he's most likely to win, but because we've got no option to bet on Francis Marshall at these odds. It just doesn't make sense. So this is one of those kind of annoying fights for pre-fight betting where the odds are undeniably wide. Like, does Eric Silva have a better than 16% chance of winning? Like, yes, probably, but he's going to lose almost every time he fights Francis Marshall, a really high percentage of the time. So it can be very, very difficult to make a profit betting guys like Silva long term, because he's not particularly dangerous, so the chances of him flash KOing Marshall are pretty low. He's not dangerous on the ground, and he's not going to be able to keep up with the pace that Marshall sets on the feet. So whilst the odds from a percentage point of view feel very wide, Silva's just hasn't got very many past the victory. And then you throw into the mix this fight is at a high altitude, and Francis Marshall's a cardio machine, and this fight becomes difficult for Silva, hence the reason why he's only a 16%, implied probability in his odds. So, this is one of those matchups where there's a lot to like about Marshall. We've spoken about his cardio, his work rate. He's 12 years younger than Silva, and we know that the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there's a 12-year age gap in a fight. They're about the same size. The stats aren't too meaningful on this one, to be fair, because if we look at Silva's record, he's only had like 3 fights in the UFC, and 2 of them ended in round 1. So Silva's not been in the octagon long enough for those stats to actually be meaningful. But the odds just feel very wide. Obviously, it is a bit of a red flag as well how Silva hasn't fought for 2 years. He might show up and look better than ever, but at 38 years old, he is at that stage in his career where he's going to be declining a lot from fight to fight. 38 is very old for a featherweight, so that's going against Silva as well. Like, in terms of how they match up from a stylistic point of view, Marshall's biggest strength is his cardio. Like, I would expect him to look flatter and more tired than usual fighting at high altitude in Mexico City, but his cardio is just genetically naturally good. He's able to push a high pace for 15 minutes, no problem. I think he'll be just fine in Mexico City. Silva slows a bit as fights wear on, nothing major. He is aggressive, he is well-rounded, his work rate is high, but it's going to be very difficult for him to keep up with a young, hungry bull like Marshall. On the feet, Silva hits harder, Marshall more of a volume striker. On the ground, Marshall definitely the better grappler, but as we've seen in Marshall's recent fight against Mayrin Santos, he is reluctant to grapple. Marshall's a guy that likes to stand and bang, even when it would make more sense for him to grapple. So if this fight stays standing, Silva might have some success early because he lands the harder shots, but I think as the fight progresses, Marshall will just outwork him, out-hustle him, and get his hand raised. So if you do want to bet this fight, you do have to take Mr. Eric Silva, because there's no way you can bet Marshall at an implied probability of 89%. But just know it's a very, very bad bet. And personally, if I were you, I would, if you really want to bet this fight to make watching it more interesting, I think Silva's the only option you've really got on a matchup like this. And unfortunately, that's the case for so many fights on this card. A lot of these are going to be dog or pass because so many matchups feature huge favourites. Now let's break down the fight between Regina Tarin and Ernesta Caracate. So Tarin is a fighter with a lot of hype behind her right now. I think mainly because she's quite hot. I see a lot of people talking about her on Twitter, posting pictures, posting videos of her. She is making a UFC debut on short notice. This fight just was made yesterday. But it's not the end of the world for Tarin. It's not super difficult circumstances to make her UFC debut under, because she was originally scheduled to fight on Saturday night anyway in a Muay Thai contest, which was actually going to be broadcast on Fight Pass. So even though she is coming in on just a few days' notice, she already had another fight scheduled, and I would anticipate has had a decent camp. Her cardio is pretty good based on past performances, so that shouldn't be a huge issue. And with her being Mexican, this fight taking place at high altitude in Mexico City, who knows, maybe Caracate will struggle with the circumstances on Saturday night more than Tarin's. I'm sure Tarin has got some experience fighting in Mexico City and training in Mexico City and living in Mexico, and being Mexican is fucking very hot, and having a load of MMA simps kind of very much looking forward to her making her debut on Saturday night. But this is a really good fight. Tarin's not bad. She's not bad at all. One issue with her is that she's very young. She's only 21 years old, and I think when fighters do come into the UFC that early in their career, it's quite detrimental to them. The lack of experience isn't good, and what we often see is that fighters that do come into the UFC very young often struggle pretty bad because it's too much too soon. If they're talented, like a Sage Northcutt or a Chase Hooper or a Paige Van Zandt, they can have a bit of success early on with some favourable matchmaking, but as soon as they face that step up in competition, the wheels come off and they tend to struggle very bad. We saw that with Sage Northcutt, we saw that with Paige Van Zandt, we also saw that with Chase Hooper, although admittedly Hooper is rather decent these days. Will we see it with Tarin as well? Well, the thing that I think is difficult for Tarin in this fight is that Ernesta Caracate is really good, and this is a very tough debut. This is a real difficult fight to come in and take on short notice, because Caracate doesn't really have any weaknesses that Tarin is well positioned to exploit. So let's take a look at the odds on this one. We don't have stats or anything like that for Tarin yet, because this fight was thrown together on very, very short notice. We can see that Caracate is a 1.52 favourite, which is minus 192 for an implied probability of 66%. Tarin 2.56 underdog, which is plus 156 for an implied probability of 39%. So both these girls very similar actually in terms of styles. Neither of them ever really tried to take their opponent down. Tarin will push you up against the cage, beat you up in the clinch a bit. But for the most part, she likes to stand and bang. She's a kickboxer. I mean, she had a Muay Thai fight scheduled for this weekend. And Caracate, very, very technical striker too. When you look at footage of both girls, I mean, this isn't going to be a surprise to anyone because Tarin's only 21. But there is much more of a rawness about her style. She's a little bit awkward, a little bit clunky on the feet. She's very aggressive. Like when she throws, everything into her shots to really try and hurt you. But she's not particularly technical. There's not a lot of fluidity there. She's got raw power, raw athleticism. She's mean. She's nasty. When she drives you into the clinch, beats you up against the cage, she's smashing you with elbows, and she's being really vicious in those positions. But she is like a bit of a aggressive Hulk type fighter is the best way I can describe her, where it's like controlled chaos with Tarin. And she's had a lot of success with that style so far in her career, going 7-0. And, she's called out some big names in the sport, and she's, pretty hot. So she's got a bit of media attention and stuff. And no doubt that's why the UFC have signed her. But what you often find with fighters like Tarin is that being tough and aggressive and really putting it on your opponent outside of the UFC on these low-level regional shows, just by being tough, aggressive, and having good cardio, those are attributes that go a long way, particularly, in South America, where the level of women's MMA on the regional circuit is quite bad. And so when you hear people talk about, Tarin being undefeated this weekend and 7-0 and all that kind of stuff, obviously it's great that she's undefeated at 7-0, but the level of fighter that she has competed against is going to be very, very low. And so what you often find with really inexperienced fighters like Tarin, who's only 21, is when she's basically run through everyone she's faced up until this point in her career, and then she faces someone that is legitimately good, that isn't going to gas out, and that isn't going to cave and go into a defensive shell as soon as you start to land some good shots on them, which is what most of Tarin's past opponents have done, then a lot of the time these inexperienced fighters get exposed a little bit. And exposed is a horrible word that I just hate using. It's a horrible, nasty, mean, malicious, ugly word. I just can't think of any other word to use in the context to describe what I'm trying to describe. But basically, when a 21-year-old who is used to being the hammer, going out there and fucking nailing everyone because she's facing a low level and all she's got to do is be mean and nasty and aggressive and hit them hard and they'll roll over and play dead. When the hammer finally becomes the nail and they're the ones on the back foot, eating the big shots, being forced to work hard, facing adversity for the first time, they often struggle. And you see that with these really young fighters like your Sage Northcutts, like your Paige Van Zants, like your Chase Hoopers. They do great smashing these low-level fighters, and as soon as they reach that mid-tier, they really start to struggle because that mid-tier fighter won't roll over and won't play dead. They'll stand toe-to-toe. They'll test you in all areas. And the UFC ain't a good place to learn. It's not a good training environment. Ideally, you want to be much more experienced before you get to that high level. And that's what causes a lot of fighters like Tarin problems. I would have liked Tarin in this fight a lot more had she maybe come into the UFC, fought like a Vanessa Demopoulos, someone like that first, find her feet, face someone, like maybe a Sam Hughes who isn't as skilled of a striker, but would maybe, be tough enough to test her takedown defense and test her clinch game and tire her out a bit, but wouldn't be someone that you'd expect to do too much damage to a Tarin, someone like that. Whereas Tarin really has been thrown in with the sharks here because Caracate is a very, very good striker in the context of the women's... Sorry, I have a hair in my mouth. Caracate's a very good striker in the context of the women's flyweight division. She moves well. She's technical. She uses her length well. She's got decent pop on her shots. She's mean. She's nasty. She's decent in the clinch. She's difficult to take down and hold down. Her cardio is very good, which she will need. Tarin might have the edge there, with this being in Mexico City at high altitude. But Caracate's cardio is usually very good, so I'm not too concerned with Caracate's cardio in this. So this is one of those fights where I am very tempted to bet Caracate, to be honest with you. I'm quite surprised she's not a bigger favourite. Usually when fighters come in on less than a week's notice, they are big underdogs, which Tarin isn't. But like I say, she should have a Muay Thai fight scheduled for Saturday, right? Very tempted to bet Caracate. Very, very tempted to bet Caracate. Very tempted to bet Caracate. This is one of those fights I haven't made my mind up yet on. You guys know me. I talk a lot about home advantage. And we're going to be talking a lot about home advantage in the breakdown videos this week. Because we know it's going to be very difficult for fighters who aren't Mexican to beat Mexicans on Saturday night in Mexico City. Home advantage is going to be big on a card like this. Not only will the fighters have the crowd on their side, which can motivate them and elevate them to reach a higher level of performance than they would have had if they fought some random person in the Apex. But we know if fights are reasonably competitive, it's unlikely that the judges will score the fight for the non-Mexican, right? That's what bothers me about this fight, because there is no doubt that Caracate is like 20 to 30% better than Tarin everywhere. There's no doubt about that. Like, the footage shows us that. Very likely Caracate will outstrike her. But Tarin is mean. She is aggressive. She is nasty. She does fight at a high pace. And she probably is good enough to make 2 of the 3 rounds close. And in Mexico, that might be all you need to beat, to beat someone who isn't from Mexico. So home advantage could be huge for Tarin in this fight. And that's the only thing that makes me nervous about Caracate here. If this fight were taking place in the Apex, I would bet Caracate without hesitation. The more I think about it, home advantage would be a big one here for Tarin. But it's very rare fighters win coming on less than a week's notice. And Tarin is only 21 years old, so it ain't going to be an easy debut for her. Best case scenario for Tarin, I think, is this is very close and she nicks a very close decision. There's no way this turns out to be an easy fight for Tarin. I will tell you that for free. It will be razor close at best for Tarin. With home advantage, that might be enough to win. So I haven't made my mind up on this one yet. I'm very tempted to bet Caracate. If you're a member of my website, obviously come join us. And I will let you know if I'm going to bet Caracate before fight night. You'll get an email. If you're a member of my website, I'll let you know. But for now, my mind is not fully made up. So, yeah, hope you found that useful. I've made a profit betting on the UFC every year for the last 15 years. And the one metric over that time, which has been a clear indicator that I have found a really good value bet, is when I research a fight and I cannot explain the odds. When the odds are so wildly inaccurate that no matter what angle I look at a fight from, I cannot explain how the odds makers setting the odds and then the betting public moving the odds. I don't know how they've arrived at the numbers they've arrived at. And really good recent examples of this is when we researched the fight between Justin Gaethje and Paddy Pimblett. We hit a really nice winner on Justin Gaethje, because when you researched the Gaethje versus Paddy fight, there was simply no justification for Gaethje being a 2-1 underdog. Other than age, Paddy had no advantages in that fight. It just didn't make sense. Another recent example, Rizvan Kunaev to beat Jailton Almeida. When I did the breakdown for that fight, I said that Kunaev should be a huge favourite. Should be a 1.40 minus 250 favourite. He should beat Almeida comfortably, yet he was the underdog. And we all saw it was a very comfortable fight for Kunaev. And another example where the odds were very, very wide very inaccurate, was when we bet on Nikita Krylov to beat Modestas Bukauskas. Again, Krylov was the slight underdog, which made no sense because he was better than Bukauskas almost everywhere. And those are 3 examples. We've had a lot more winners that tick those boxes this year, but those were 3 examples from the last few events where you research the fight and no logical person that has spent time researching that matchup can explain why the odds are the way they are. And that is exactly how I feel about this Douglas Silva Deandra versus Javier Reyes fight. I just can't explain why Andrade is a big underdog here. Similar to the Gaethje versus Paddy fight, I get that Andrade is old. I get that he's coming in on a bit of a layoff, which isn't ideal for a fighter his age. But skill for skill, the odds make no sense here. And I would personally have Andrade as the favourite. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a deep dive into this one and explain the exact reasons why I'm betting Andrade this weekend. So Andrade is a 2.87 underdog, which is plus 187 for an implied probability of 35%. And Reyes is a 1.43 favourite, which is minus 234 for an implied probability of 70%. So if we bring up the fighter comparison tool, the age for Andrade isn't loading, but I can tell you that he's 40 years old. So this is one of the advantages that Reyes does have going for him. We know that the younger fighter wins close to 70% of the time when there's an 8-year age gap in a fight. So it's definitely not ideal that Andrade is 40. That's old as hell. That's ancient for a featherweight. We can also see that Reyes has a 5-inch reach advantage, which is very nice, although he doesn't do a particularly good job of using it. There's no point in looking at stats comparisons. If we look at Reyes' record, we can see this is his UFC debut, and he's only spent 2.5 minutes under the Zuffa banner, so we don't have very good quality stats for Mr. Reyes. So this is one of those fights where the odds are totally crazy, because even at 40 years old, Andrade is still a nightmare. He is still a nightmare, and this is a huge step up in competition for Reyes. On top of that, this is Reyes' UFC debut, and it's never easy to make a UFC debut under any circumstances, especially when you're facing someone like Andrade, who's very aggressive, hits very hard, fights at a high pace, is well-rounded, and exceptionally experienced. In terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, the main reason why I like Andrade is that there's a real flatness about everything that Reyes does. And I'll bring up a little bit of footage of Reyes so that you can see for yourself. So these two fights ended pretty quickly. So we'll bring up this fight against Chris Caracate from last year. It's only May last year, so not even a year ago. So we'll bring this up and the audio will play, so I'll have to mute it really quick. I hate how Fight Pass does that. There we go. So what we'll do, we'll start the fight, and as I'm breaking down how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, just have a little look-see at Reyes. So when I first started researching this matchup, I watched footage of Douglas Silva Deandra first. And obviously he's slowing down at his age, right? He's 40 years old. But his decline isn't massive, right? If we take a look at... Sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. We take a look at Deandra's record. We haven't seen him for 2 years, which isn't good. That's certainly a risk factor. And there's 3 risk factors now that are present with Andrade: his age, his layoff, and the reach disadvantage that he's giving up to Reyes. But some of those risk factors are somewhat offset by the fact that this is Reyes' UFC debut, and that has downsides, right? Octagon jitters, increased probability of an adrenaline dump, all that kind of thing. So I understand that Andrade has issues, but you're never going to find a fighter in this odds range that doesn't have issues. It's very rare you're going to find a fighter who is most likely to win at an implied probability of 35%, because if they were most likely to win, they would be the favourite. That's just the harsh, brutal reality of it, right? It's extremely rare that you get massive errors in the odds, like with Rizvan Kuniev, where he should 100% legitimately have been the favourite. Very rare the market is that off. But you do get situations like with Andrade where there's no way he should be this big of an underdog. And while there are risk factors present with him, those risk factors should price Andrade closer to the even money odds range, or as a slight underdog in my opinion, than almost a 2-1 underdog. And if we get back to the footage on Reyes, you'll see why. So when we watch footage of Andrade, we know what he brings to the table, right? He hits like a truck. He's got true legit knockout power, even though he doesn't have tons of knockouts on his record. You know, he has that kind of raw power and aggression that when he lands clean and hard on his opponents, he really gets their attention. He wakes them up, and, you know, he's rocked multiple guys, dropped multiple guys, that kind of thing. We know Andrade is a guy with major power. We also know for a big muscular guy, his cardio's not that bad. Now, whether it will remain to be reasonably good at 40 years old after a 2-year layoff, you know, competing in high altitude in Mexico City, I doubt it. But at least based on past performances, it's not like Andrade's cardio is terrible for his body type. Yes, he slows down a bit as fights wear on, but that's somewhat offset by the fact that he's comfortable fighting tired, he's tough as nails, and an absolute dog that will keep pushing and giving his everything until the very last second. We also know he's difficult to take down and hold down. He's strong and physically imposing, and he's reasonably skilled on the ground. So Andrade is one of these guys that doesn't really have any weaknesses other than, obviously, the unknowns and the physical disadvantages being his age, the reach that he's given up, and also the fact that he's coming on a 2-year layoff. But if you just evaluate Andrade based on his skills, he's got knockout power, he's aggressive on the feet, he fights at a high pace, his chin is still very much intact for a 40-year-old, he's got a granite chin, he's tough as nails, he's difficult to take down, difficult to hold down, he's experienced, he's very physically imposing. I mean, I've got a lot of good things to say about Andrade in the context of this fight, because when you look at Reyes, you've been watching footage of him for 2.5 minutes now, you can see there's a real flatness about everything that Reyes does. He's not that athletic, he's not that physically imposing, he doesn't read his opponents particularly well. You can see in this first round he's been caught cold with a lot of shots that he hasn't seen coming. He's very flat-footed, he's not a particularly strong, physically imposing grappler. His cardio is decent, he's a tough guy, but for me, Reyes is bang average. And the fact that he is, you know, a big favourite at an implied probability of 70%, making his UFC debut against someone as tough, as well-rounded, as consistent, and dangerous as Douglas Silva de Andrade, it's just wacky to me. Now look, stats need to be respected, and I understand that the younger guy wins around 70% of the time when there's an 8-year age gap in a fight. But go watch this fight, go watch Reyes' recent fights. There's just a real flatness to everything that he does. He doesn't read his opponents particularly well. His striking defense is bad. His movement's bad. His technique is bad. He's a volume striker, right? Look, he's just getting dinged, you know. And you know, if you're watching this, you know how hard Andrade hits, how dangerous Andrade is. When I watched this fight, which took place 9 months ago, I don't see how Andrade is the underdog. I mean, look, he walks into a clean right hand there, right? He just doesn't read Caracate at all in this fight. Doesn't see the shots coming, doesn't read him. And this is in the first round when he should be fresh. It's not like he's tired and getting sloppy. You know, look, his grappling is not particularly good. It doesn't look particularly strong in these positions. We know how strong, how powerful, how athletic, how tanky Douglas Silva de Andrade is. And for those of you not familiar with Andrade, I mean, I'm talking about Andrade like you all know who Andrade is. Let's show you Douglas Silva de Andrade. Let's go side by side so you can see what I'm talking about, right? You've just seen how flat Reyes looked. Look how strong, look how physically imposing, look how explosive Andrade is. I mean, he looks incredible, right? He's 38 years old here. But for an old guy, great shape, decent cardio, tough as nails, granite chin, aggressive, true legit knockout power. Just a fucking nightmare of a guy to face on your debut. You know, in one of his recent fights, he beat Cody Stamann, who's no picnic. I know, very different style to Reyes. But just moves well. Tough, aggressive, tanky. Very passive in this first round. Obviously, a guy like Andrade is going to start slow in an effort to pace himself. Should we skip through, going to round 2 when he opens up a bit more? Let's go into round 2 when he opens up a bit more. But in terms of speed, technique, power, athleticism, movement, defensively, Andrade is so much better than Reyes in all those categories. I say as he gets stung with a jab. Curse the commentator. But you can just see he moves a lot better. Way more fluidity to him. Difficult to take down and hold down, which you'd expect from a guy with a lower body as strong and as thick as this. I just think Andrade is great value this weekend. And like I say, you know, when you bet on a 40-year-old guy, you're never going to be putting your money in a super strong position. But if it were me, having a tough, dangerous, powerful, experienced veteran like Andrade against a debutant who looks kind of flat and average, having Andrade as such a big underdog, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So, yes, I think he's a good bet this weekend. Let me know what you think, though, in the chat room on the website or in the comments below. We know the fighters often struggle in their UFC debuts, especially when they face tough, experienced veterans. And so we'll see if Andrade is going to be capable. I mean, it shouldn't be an upset, but it kind of is because of the odds. And yeah, you can just see the difference in movement there. Obviously, Miles Johns is great. His footwork, his movement is great. He's very technical. Something else to consider as well, this fight is taking place at featherweight. And Douglas Silva de Andrade usually fights at bantamweight, so maybe he will look a bit better at featherweight, where he hasn't got to kill himself, to make weight. So yeah, interesting fight. Reyes looks bang average to me. He is obviously most likely to win. I mean, he wouldn't be a 70% implied probability favourite if he wasn't more likely to win. But as a cheeky little sprinkle on a good value underdog, I think Andrade ain't bad this weekend. Hopefully he comes through for us. And with that, I think it's time we move on to breaking down the next fight. Now let's break down the fight between Christian Quinones and Chris Matinho. Another fight where the odds feel really, really wide. Quinones a 1.15 favourite, which is minus 687 for an implied probability of 87%. And Matinho a 5.73 underdog, which is plus 473 for an implied probability of 18%. Now, you would have to be a crazy person to think that Matinho is more likely to win this weekend. He isn't. But again, we've got to let the odds do the work for us. And at an implied probability of 87%, Quinones is just unplayable here. So whilst he is a decent amount better than Matinho everywhere, we've got to let the odds do the work for us. And this is clearly dog or pass. Now, having said that, I would be amazed if Matinho wins this, because whilst he is tough and he is durable to some extent, he is also a fighter that gets rocked, wobbled and dropped a lot. And even though Quinones is not the most dangerous on the feet, he's more of a volume striker. We've seen Matinho get rocked, wobbled and dropped against a bunch of guys, even on the regional circuit, who also aren't that dangerous. You've also got to throw into the mix, this fight is taking place at a high altitude. Quinones is Mexican. He's got experience fighting at high altitude. And while Matinho has great cardio, obviously less oxygen going to the brain, more chance of being KO'd. And Matinho is already one of those guys that does get rocked, wobbled and dropped. When I call Matinho durable, what I mean is that he is a tough fucker that is difficult to put away. Matinho is one of those guys that will keep fighting till his last breath. But at the same time, his paths to victory in this fight are very slim, because he's not going to be able to out-grapple Quinones. Quinones is a better grappler. Matinho is a volume striker, so the probability of him like flash KOing a tough young Mexican isn't very high. Matinho doesn't really have knockout power, so the only way that realistically he could beat Quinones in this would be to outstrike him, which again is very, very unlikely because Quinones is the better striker and he has home advantage on his side. So similar to the Franklin Marshall and Eric Silva fight, while the odds do feel wide on this one, and they always should feel wide in this odds range because MMA is a crazy chaotic sport where giving anyone an 87% chance of winning is difficult to do. Whilst the odds do feel wide here, at the same time, Matinho doesn't have any realistic path to victory outside of the crazy stuff happening, like Quinones getting disqualified or fighting injured or something crazy happening like that. But in this sport, crazy things often do happen, and so maybe they'll happen again this weekend, but I doubt it. Quinones should win easily. We've got to let the odds do the work for us. I'm not going to be able to bet this fight. Let's move on to a more interesting one. So I am betting Macy Chiazon this weekend, and I'm probably going to regret it because she is the exact kind of fighter that lets me down frequently. But like I always say, you've got to let the odds do the work for you, and there's just no way, based on past performances, that Chiazon should be a decent sized underdog. And so I've got to bet her, even if I don't feel great about it. Just like I don't feel great about betting Douglas Silva Deandra at 40 years old. I didn't feel great about betting on Justin Gaethje when he was old against Paddy Pimblett and he came through for us. These are the bets you've got to take. You've just got to let the odds do the work for you. But there's no doubt Chiazon is the exact kind of fighter that usually lets us down. And we'll get into the reasons why as we delve into this fight from a betting point of view. Of course, she isn't fighting Alex Perez. The automated system that I've got, the automated system that manages all the data within my research tool, has obviously got confused by the surnames. Alex Perez, Aylin Perez. So that's a bug that needs to be fixed. But yes, Aylin Perez should not be this big of a favourite. And now I'll do my best to explain why. So she's a 1.55 favourite, which is minus 183 for an implied probability of 65%. And Chiazon is a 2.49 underdog, which is plus 149 for an implied probability of 40%. So before we get into talking about how these two match up stylistically, I'm going to let you know my position on this fight, so that you understand the risks if you're going to also tail me on this one and bet Chiazon, because this is a million miles away from a rock solid safe bet. This is one of those riskier bets that I have to take from time to time just because the odds are completely bananas. So I personally think this is a 50-50 fight, and so I would cap Chiazon as having a 50% chance of winning. I would cap Aylin Perez as having a 50% chance of winning. And if you understand probability, you will know that means that I don't actually think Chiazon will win. I think this could go either way. So right now there are a bunch of people watching this video that will be like, oh, okay, that makes sense, because if Chiazon is a 2.49 underdog, that gives her an implied probability of 40%. If Chris thinks Chiazon has got a 50% chance of winning, that is a really nice 10% margin of value over the bookies. Many of you will be thinking that. Many of you are smart. You understand sports betting, and the Chiazon bet will make logical sense to you based on what I've just explained. There will be other people watching this video that'll be a little bit confused as to why I would bet someone that I don't think is more likely to win. And I understand a lot of people have that opinion, but when it comes to making money betting on sports, you hear me say you've got to let the odds do the work for you. And this is a classic example of me letting the odds do the work for us. There's no reason why Aylin Perez should be a favourite in this fight. Chiazon is better than her almost everywhere, and you could argue that Chiazon is far more deserving of being a favourite in this matchup than Perez is. Therefore, Chiazon as an underdog at an implied probability of 40% makes no sense at all. At worst, Chiazon has got a 50% chance of winning this fight and a 10% margin of value over the bookies in the odds is brilliant. It's not easy to achieve a margin that big in sports betting, so we've got to take Chiazon, even though it's a risky bet because she is a muppet. But we will get into that in a little bit more detail shortly. So, where do we begin? Let's start off with the fighter comparison tool. So if we bring up the stats, we can see that Ailin Perez is a bit younger, but age doesn't mean anything here. And this is where the advantages start to rack up for Chiazon. So she has a huge size and reach advantage here. So she's 6 inches taller and has a 6-inch reach advantage and a 6-inch leg reach advantage. So all these size advantage compound together, right? Not only is she taller, but she's a lot longer as well. And while she doesn't always use that length particularly well, she is big, she is strong, she is physically imposing. Size matters in MMA. And when these two face off at the weigh-ins on Friday, this could be one of those fights where the size difference looks comedic. I would expect Chiazon to look a weight class or two bigger than Perez. She will be absolutely massive. And like I say, size matters in MMA. Physicality matters in MMA. Now, in terms of the stats on this one, both girls are primarily grapplers. We can see Chiazon lands slightly more strikes per minute than Perez, although I would imagine the majority of these strikes are ground strikes. So I can't imagine if this fight were to stay standing, especially with the reach and leg reach advantage for Chiazon, I can't imagine that the striking stats would be close. Chiazon should outstrike Perez pretty comfortably. Perez slightly more accurate, but again, big percentage of her strikes probably ground strikes. Perez slightly better defensively as well. You can see that both girls are pretty aggressive with their takedown attempts. An average of 2 per fight is above average. An average of 4.68 per fight for Ailin Perez, very much above average. Both girls are difficult to take down, but the takedown defense stat of 71% for Chiazon is quite important. As you can see, neither girl is really that aggressive with the submission, though. They both tend to favour ground and pound and control. And in terms of the strike distribution chart, they both mix it up quite a lot, go into the legs and the body, more than most fighters actually, where most fighters target above 80% of their strikes to their head. So Perez, Chiazon mix it up a little bit more than most. So, in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, both of them are primarily grapplers. And this is where I think the value really starts to become apparent with Chiazon. Because as we've said, size matters in MMA. And 5'5" for Ailin Perez is really small for a bantamweight. She should probably be fighting in the flyweight division, but probably doesn't want to cut weight, fights a bantamweight, and she can kind of get away with it because the skill level at bantamweight is pretty low. But the thing about Chiazon is that she's pretty bloody good when she shows up. She's strong, she's physically imposing, she's a good MMA grappler, she's heavy from top position, she's got nasty ground and pound, and she's difficult to take down. She's got that 71% takedown defense stat. Perez has good timing on her takedown entries. She's heavy from top position, but Perez is also a fighter that does burn through a lot of energy when grappling and does have a tendency to slow down in fights, especially if you make her work really hard for takedowns. Now remember, this fight is taking place in Mexico City, so even though Perez has got that Latin American blood, being Argentinian, she is one of those fighters that, you know, if you make her work really hard, she does have a tendency to slow. So on the ground, both girls heavy from top position. Perez's offensive wrestling is better, to be fair. She's got better takedown entries than Macy. But from top position, they're both pretty heavy. I would say Chiazon is the more technically skilled grappler, whereas Perez has got more hustle and more work rate about her, more tenacity, more determination in getting takedowns and winding up on top. But Chiazon, more technical on the ground and better in the scramble. So on the feet, there's another area where Chiazon would have a pretty big advantage even before the size difference. So Chiazon hits harder than Perez, is more technical, better defensively, and at times more aggressive. And we'll get back to the reason why only at times she's more aggressive shortly. But if you go watch her fight against Felipe Bunes, Silva, you'll see that aggression really come out in Chiazon, where she really demonstrated that killer instinct and really went for it. So at this point, you're probably wondering why Chris doesn't love Chiazon here and why he's not telling you to go and bet your house on Chiazon, because, you know, she's got the size advantage, she's got better cardio, she's the better grappler, and she's the better striker, and she's the underdog. Like, oh my god, what's there not to like about Chiazon, right? And Perez isn't particularly dangerous either. She's a bit of a decisionator, as we can see from her record. Decision. So what is there not to like about Chiazon? Why isn't Chris telling me this is one of the best bets of all time? Because when you watch my breakdown video for Kunev versus Jailton Almeida recently, I literally said to you that a bet on Kunev at underdog odds is one of the best value bets of the last year. I can't remember a bet that was as good a value as Kunev. That was an absolute gift from the bookies. Why am I not saying the same about Chiazon when she has seemingly just as many advantages as Kunev, and the cherry on top, she's bigger and has better cardio? Well, the problem with Chiazon, and the reason why she's got this very sketchy 10-5 record, is that Chiazon is weak in the one area of MMA which often decides the outcome of fights. GSP famously said that fighting was 90% mental, and this is an area where Chiazon is particularly weak. For some reason, she has self-destructive tendencies, bad fight IQ, and at times she makes decisions where it's almost like she's actively trying to lose. If you said to me, name the top 3 most skilled fighters in the women's bantamweight division, I would probably have Chiazon in the top 3. I think she's brilliant. Her grappling, when she shows up, is legitimately a nightmare, because not only is she technically skilled, but she's very big, very physically imposing, and that goes a long way in women's MMA. The problem with Chiazon is that she just doesn't have that never say die Max Holloway, Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier no quit, always shows up and brings it, Benoit Saint-Denis will fight to the death energy. She just doesn't have that. And fights are so often decided by strategy, game planning, fight IQ, attitude, and desire and determination to win. Those are the things that usually decide the outcome of fights. And those are the things that Chiazon is not good at. And so, at the beginning of this breakdown, I said to you that I think this fight is 50-50. The reason why I capped this fight at 50-50 is because it's always 50-50 whether Chiazon is actually going to show up and perform to her full potential or not. And so the reason why I give her a 50% chance of winning this is because half the time she's going to show up, fight to her full potential, dominate Ailin Perez and make this look easy. And she can do that any way she wants. She can neutralize the threat of Perez's takedowns, keep it on the feet, use her size, use her length, use her superior striking to just blast Perez and pick her apart. She can go to the ground with Perez, out-scramble her, get into top position, smash her from top position. Or she can take Perez down and out-grapple her. This is one of those fights where if both girls show up and perform to their full potential, Perez has almost no way to win. Because if you look at her record, like I say, she's a decisionator. She's not going to submit Chiazon if Chiazon's at her best. She's not going to knock her out. She's not going to out-grapple her. Chiazon can dominate this fight wherever she wants, if she shows up. But she only shows up 50% of the time, maybe not even that. And so, I cap her at 50-50, because if she shows up, she'll win easily, she'll dominate. If she doesn't show up, she'll probably be very passive, make a bunch of mistakes, give up cheap takedowns, spend too long on the bottom, letting Perez chip away at her from top position, and just let the clock run down and not really show much urgency or a desire to win rounds and put her stamp on rounds. That's the Chiazon that shows up sometimes and is very frustrating to watch. But at 2.49, 2.50, plus 150 in this odds range, she's a great bet. Because even if she doesn't show up, you're betting on a fighter that, if they do show up, dominates very high percentage of the time. Like, if you said to me, how would you cap this fight? Say you came to me, right, and you were like, Chris, I've got a crystal ball. I can see exactly how all the fights are going to go on Saturday night. And I can tell you with 1,000,000% certainty that Chiazon will show up and fight to her full potential on Saturday night. Where would you cap her? I would literally cap her at like 80%. You know, I'd have her as like a 1.20 minus 400 favourite. That's how confident I am in Chiazon if she shows up. But the question is, will she show up? Fighting is 90% mental. We're all in our head. We all suffer from performance anxiety, stress, pressure. And it affects someone like Chiazon more than most. So before we wrap this breakdown up, so I think I've made my point, I really want to spend some time talking about the cherry on top of the cake and just why this is such a great bet. And we're going to focus on Ailin Perez's cardio. So obviously the fight this weekend is taking place in Mexico City at high altitude, and we know that high altitude badly affects the cardio of almost all fighters unless they live and train at high altitude in Mexico City. Now, Macy Chiazon is a cardio machine. She never slows down, so I don't think the high altitude is going to bother her very much. But Ailin Perez does have a long history of gassing out. Now, to be fair to Ailin Perez, her cardio has improved exponentially over the last few years. She doesn't tire out like she used to, and in 2025/2026, she's able to fight at a decent pace for 3 rounds without slowing down. However, being able to fight at a decent pace for 3 rounds at sea level is totally different from being able to fight at a high pace at high altitude. And so, while Perez has made huge improvements to her cardio, I think that could rear its ugly head on Saturday night. And I do think it is quite likely that if Chiazon has anywhere near a desire to win this, any desire at all, and actually tries, I think the second half of this fight, when Perez starts to tire out at high altitude, could get very easy for Chiazon. Because what you tend to see from Perez when she gets tired is she does start to give up position a lot on the ground, pull guard, that kind of thing, because the ground is a safe place and she'd rather be on her back than on her feet getting punched in the face. And so when Perez gets tired, you do see her give up position a lot, and she is quite weak off her back. So I'm just going to bring up a few clips from the last few years so you can kind of see what I mean. Now again, I just want to reiterate that Perez's cardio isn't bad anymore. She has made big improvements to her cardio, but she does pull guard and make a lot of mistakes on the ground in the second half of fights when she gets tired. So obviously we're going to be focusing a lot on the second half of fights here because we're trying to show cardio, and we're going to be focusing heavily on the third round of fights as well. So if we skip through, I'm going to be showing you some third round performances. So there's no grappling in the second half of that round. So yeah, anyway, watch second half of round 3, and you can just see that on the feet, Perez, she's not a natural striker, we know that. She's predominantly a grappler, but in the third round of her fights, isn't able to generate as much drive on her takedown entries. There's more of a flatness about what she does. Skip through here, back to the middle of the octagon, and you'll just see that she's a little bit sloppy on the feet. Not the best defensively, but you can see her cardio's not bad here. She's still bouncing around light on her feet. Movement's not too bad. It's not like she's breathing too heavy. There's more of a flatness, more of a sloppiness about her in this third round against Cara Rosa, but nothing too major. She doesn't look terrible here. And this is just, you know, I wanted to show you this because if you were of the perception that Perez does have terrible cardio, like she did just a few years ago, I wanted you to see this clip for yourself, which is her last fight, just to show you how much she's improved in that area. So yeah, sloppy, but cardio not terrible. So if we go a little bit further back though, and we take a look at this fight against Jocelyn Edwards, and we skip ahead to the 3rd round. This fight is good for showing us what happens when Perez starts to get a little tired and how weak she is off her back. So from this position, goes for a throw, looks to take the back, and loses the scramble.
I'm not a rapper, I'm a singer with the flow. I've got a habit of spitting quicker lyrics.
Alexa, stop. So we can see here, Aylin Perez goes for a judo throw up against the cage. Looks to take the back. Loses the scramble here, winds up on the bottom. And there's about 1:20 left to go in the round. And this is where you can see just how weak Perez looks off her back. So where we were talking about Macy Chiazon having a very heavy top game and being able to have a lot of success if she actually tries to win by being able to out-grapple Perez, you can kind of see it here. We'll just skip through. Perez is a grappler, but if you put her on her back, she's very, very, very weak off her back. If we then go into this 3rd round, wait until they're out of this clinch and you'll have a better look at Perez. In this 3rd round, there's been quite a bit of grappling in this fight, quite a bit of clinch work. It's been quite a fast-paced fight. But in this 3rd round, again, you can just see more of a flatness to Perez. She's very flat-footed. Not as light on her feet as she was against Cara Rosa. Cara Rosa, she was kind of bouncing around much lighter than this. She's moving a little bit for the most part. She's very flat-footed in this 3rd round. And what you really notice about Perez when she starts to get tired is kind of what you're seeing here against Jocelyn Edwards, where her volume drops. Like you see subtle little signs here, like when she's trying to run away, Alistair Overeem style, running away, mouth open wide. This is her just trying to catch a bit of a break in there and find some space. Now Edwards doesn't do a particularly good job of making her pay for the fact that she's slowing down and becoming quite flat-footed. And this is the exact kind of mistake that Chiazon would make as well. It's quite clear that Perez is tiring here by how flat-footed she's becoming. She's just trying to back up and catch her breath, and Edwards is kind of letting her get away with it. But that's low-level women's MMA for you. You can see she's just trying to avoid engaging while she catches her breath. And Edwards just totally letting her get away with it. So this clip is kind of showing that even though her cardio looked a lot better at Cara Rosa, against Cara Rosa, again, for the most part, Aylin Perez was in total control against Cara Rosa. She was able to get Rosa to the ground, control her from top position. Jocelyn Edwards forced her to work harder, and that's why you see here Perez's volume's fallen off a cliff, because she doesn't have as much energy to perform as well in this 3rd round. So my logic is, if we saw Perez's output fall this significantly in this 3rd round against Jocelyn Edwards, even though she's not gassed here, her volume has notably dropped in this 3rd to the point where she hasn't really done anything because she's too busy backing up trying to catch her breath. So my logic with this one is, if she's gonna look this tired in the 3rd round at sea level, then maybe she looks like this in round 2 at high altitude in Mexico City against Chiazon. And if that happens, it becomes even easier for Chiazon to outwork her, even if we don't get the best version of Chiazon and we get a bit more of a, passive Chiazon isn't as aggressive as we saw her against Mayra Bueno Silva. So yeah, this is one of those fights where you can just see Perez kind of passive in the third round, waited for that takedown till very, very late on. But outside of that, really didn't do much in the third. And then the next fight, let's throw the Pudilova fight up. Again, let's skip into the third round. Where you can see her card. And the reason why, again, we're focusing on the third round is my logic is if you slow down in the third and start making mistakes in the third at sea level, you're more likely to make mistakes earlier in the fight at high altitude in Mexico City, maybe in round 2, right? I mean, we sometimes see fighters gas out after 2, 3, 4 minutes if they, if their cardio isn't actually on point. A fighter with bad cardio will slow after a minute or two at high altitude, but I wouldn't expect that from Perez. So you can see there, she gives up position there off a kick. So we see her on her back here. We saw her on her back towards the end of round 2 against Jocelyn Edwards, and Edwards is able to hold her down pretty easily. Let's see how Pudilova does, because Perez isn't in a particularly bad position here. She's relatively close to the cage, so she hasn't got to move far to get her back tight to the cage to start wall walking back up to her feet. You can see there's only about a foot there in distance. So there's 4 minutes 20 seconds left to go. Let's skip through. So within a minute she's able to pop back up to her feet. Very, very nice. But then this is what I mentioned earlier on in the breakdown, where if you make Perez work hard, she will fade very quickly, especially if you make her work hard for takedowns. And so you see it here where she shoots a takedown, realizes she's not going to get it, and just immediately pulls guard. And again, I know this is the third round. I know naturally she's going to be tiring in the third, but similar to the last fight against Jocelyn Edwards, my logic being if her volume dropped in round 3 against Jocelyn Edwards because she was tired, and if she starts pulling guard on failed takedown attempts in round 3 against Pudilova because she's tired, will she start to do these things in round 2 at high altitude when she gets tired instead of round 3? Like you see here, as soon as she realizes she's not going to get the takedown again, she rolls to her back for safety. Again, she's had opportunities to pop back up to her feet there, but she chooses to roll to her back for safety. And again here, goes for a lazy judo throw. Again, ends up on the bottom. And Macy Chiazon's grappling control is far stronger than Pudilova's. Chiazon's a very, very good grappler. If Chiazon shows up and she's able to put Perez in these positions, Chiazon will inflict major damage with ground and pound. I mean, she's absolutely vicious. I mean, while we're at it, let's show you. Now, obviously, she has a 6-inch height, 6-inch reach, 6-inch leg reach advantage over Perez. And we saw Perez looking quite flat, quite sloppy on the feet against both Caro Rosa and Jocelyn Edwards. So you can see Chiazon moves a lot better than Mayra Bueno Silva, is more technical, is more aggressive, she hits harder than Perez. It really is just a question with Chiazon as to whether or not she will show up, because when she does show up, she is pretty nasty and she can fight at a high pace. She can inflict major damage on you. Battling for position in the clinch. Let's just skip out of the clinch position. Want to see some striking. You can see a real difference between the two of them on the feet, Perez and Chiazon. There's no doubt Chiazon's significantly better striker, but trust me, she's a better grappler as well. It just depends on if she actually shows up and tries to grapple. That's pretty much it for the round. And then in round 2, she comes out the gate aggressive at the beginning of round 2. looking for those elbows. It's actually an elbow that ends the fight for Macy. Shortly after getting the takedown, she lands that nice elbow on the inside there to cut Silva, and that was the beginning of the end for Silva. So yeah, this is one of those fights where I think at worst is 50-50. If Chiazon shows up, she'll win easily. Hopefully she shows up. She probably won't, although if we look at her record, she has lost her last two. You know, if you lose 3 in a row, you often lose your job in the UFC. So she can't really afford to lose another one. So if Chiazon wants to keep her job in the UFC, she really needs to win this weekend. And if we bring up her fight against Yana Santos and we go to the 3rd round, might be able to see a bit of grappling, ground and pound from Chiazon. So we've seen a bit from Perez. Only 2 minutes left to go in this round, but you'll get a good look at what she can do on the ground when she's in top position. This is where you get to see the aggressive ground and pound from Chiazon that I've mentioned throughout the video, and why Perez could be in a lot of trouble if she ends up on the bottom. So Chiazon showed strong hips there to maintain top position on Yana, and this is one of the reasons why size could be such a big factor in this fight, because if Perez and Chiazon start scrambling on the ground battling for position, Chiazon is so much bigger, so much stronger, has so much more leverage with her size than Perez, who's just 5'5". And in this final minute, you get to see when Chiazon does have that killer instinct and go for it from top position, just what she's capable of doing. She's a far more fluid, far more technical technical grappler than Perez. So yeah, basically take my money. There's no way Chiazon should be an underdog in this fight. The odds just don't make any sense at all. Chiazon is a decent grappler, and if she shows up, Perez is in a lot of trouble. Problem is, quite often Chiazon doesn't show up, and like we said, fighting is 90% mental, which is a bit of an issue. So yeah, hopefully Chiazon comes through for us. I don't feel great about it. Someone's actually just put a prediction in for the fight there. You saw the bar move. Wonder who's putting their predictions in. Should we have a look? Ah, sweet username. Shout out to you, Justin, mate. Shout out to you, dude, putting your predictions in. So yeah, I've got Chiazon to win. Hopefully she comes through for us, but it is risky because she can't be trusted, and I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Ryan Gandra versus Jose Medina. And this is another one of those fights where the odds feel extremely wide, and it's just impossible to bet on the big favourite at an implied probability of 87%. Gandra is more likely to win, but in order to get any value on him, you'd have to give him a better than 90% chance of winning, which is impossible in a sport like this, which is so crazy, chaotic and unpredictable. Where this fight is a little bit different to matchups like, sorry guys, my dogs are going crazy. Where this matchup is a little bit different to fights like Francis Marshall versus Eric Silva, and also Quinones versus Matinho, is Matinho and Silva don't really have any real victory for the reasons that we discussed in those breakdowns. I won't go into them again now. For all of Medina's weaknesses and for how bad he is, there is actually one path to victory that he has in this matchup. Make Medina the most appealing big underdog out of all the big underdogs in those 3 fights we've just mentioned, if you wanted to mix it up a little bit and throw a few flyers on some really risky big underdog bets. I think Medina loses a very, very high percentage of the time, but I will show you a little bit of footage which will help you understand that if this fight goes a certain way, Gandra could find himself in a little bit of trouble. So, with Medina being a 5.77 plus 477 underdog, that gives him an implied probability of 17%, which means if you could just give him a 1 in 4 chance, a 25% chance of winning, even though he's very likely to lose, you're still getting a good margin of value over the bookies long term. And whilst I'm not personally betting Medina this weekend, because I do think he loses a very high percentage of the time, this is a matchup where the odds feel very, very wide, and I'll keep saying that because they are a bit crazy. So if we bring up the fighter comparison tool, obviously Gandra, he has only had, this will load any second now, he's only had one fight under the Zuffa banner and it only lasted 3 minutes. So it's not worth looking at the actual stats on this fight, but we can see that both guys are about the same age and about the same size. So there's nothing too major going on there in terms of X factors. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, we know that Medina is a very one-dimensional striker, pretty bad takedown defense, pretty bad on the ground, doesn't really have too much power in his hands. And Medina's main attribute is his toughness and his cardio. So his path to victory against most guys is just trying to rocky them and just stay alive, drag them into deep waters, and hope they fade. And this is where Medina's path to victory in this fight comes in, because Gandra is an amazing one-round fighter, very aggressive, very dangerous on the feet, fast hands, true legit knockout power, does a bit of grappling as well, pretty good takedowns, decent top control, and so the likelihood is that Gandra will just come out in round 1, put a crazy pace on Medina, chip away at him on the feet, and most likely knock him out. But if we look at Gandra's record, you can see, like a lot of other fighters on this card, namely, Regina Tarin, Damian Penis. Yes, can't believe. I want to find out how to actually pronounce this guy's surname. I'm sure it isn't Penis, but it's close. And where's Schultz? Like these guys, he doesn't have a whole lot of experience going past the first round. If we take a look at his record, you can see round 1, round 1, round 1, round 2, round 1, decision here. And then round 1, round 1, round 1, decision, and round 3. So, we're talking about Medina's main attribute and really only redeeming quality as being the fact that he is just tough as nails, very durable, and just aims to try and stay alive in fights and rocky guys. And obviously this fight this weekend is at high altitude in Mexico City, so when we have cards taking place at high altitude, we've discussed on all the other breakdowns on this video, fighters are much more likely to slow down and gas out. And with Medina being Bolivian, he's probably lived most of his life in a high altitude climate. I think Bolivia is one of the most. I think Bolivia is maybe not the most, maybe Chile is the most, but Bolivia is one of the highest altitude countries in the world, I believe. And so the altitude's unlikely to affect Medina. He'll probably just look completely normal in these conditions, whereas for Gandra it could be a real issue. And if we look at this fight, one of his only fights in his career that went to a decision, albeit it was almost 3 years ago now, and so I'm sure that Gandra has improved a lot since then. But cardio's not an easy thing to improve, right? Sometimes it's just genetic, sometimes you just can't fight at a high pace for 3 rounds, it's just the way you are. Some fighters go their whole careers having bad cardio. And so if we hit play here, this is the midway point of the fight, and you can see that Gandra is just very, very tired and flat here. This is the midway point of the fight. He's flat-footed, his output is low, and all that explosiveness that we see from him in the beginning of fights has been replaced by a flatness and a sloppiness. You can see he's really sloppy here, really reckless. And after each of these explosive bursts, he does look extremely tired. So he gets the takedown there. If we skip forward a bit so you can actually see him You know, you can actually see him as he's up on the feet. I mean, this is a pretty funny clip here. After some scrambles on the ground, he actually has to lift himself up by grabbing the cage. Watch this. You very rarely see fighters so tired that they need to grab the cage to stand back up. And watch the big visible deep breath that he takes here. Big visible deep breath. And then clearly, visibly, extremely tired. I mean, look at the difference in how slow his hand speed is here compared to, you know, before that grappling exchange where, you know, he launched a blitzing attack on his opponent and tried to knock him out. And like, look at these deep breaths. Look how tired Gandra is here. So, very tired, very sloppy, clearly exhausted. And I mean, look at the round. We're only in the second round here. So, at high altitude, this is one of those fights where if Medina can just stay alive, it is, based on this performance at least, quite likely Gandra will punch himself out, gas out very bad, and then that's when Medina can kind of weaponize his cardio and maybe find a way to win. You know, look, Medina's very bad, striking defense bad, no power in his hands, but he is a tough fucker, and he does have great cardio, and when you're fighting in Mexico City against someone that might not have particularly good cardio, those two attributes can go a long way. So, you know, Medina is one of those liver underdogs in this odds range on this card. I would expect him to lose. I'm not going to be betting him myself. But I just thought I would show you that because a lot of people just think Medina's absolutely trash and he's a bum and they'll automatically, you know, throw guys he's fighting into their parlays and stuff. So I just wanted to show you that because there's no way I would be betting on a guy like Gandra who looked that tired in the second round of a fight at an implied probability of 87%. It's just absurd. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Imanol Rodriguez and Kevin Borjas. And I know I keep saying it, and I sound like a broken record, but this is another one of those fights where the odds just feel very, very wide. And, you know, there's no doubt that Imanol Rodriguez is most likely to win, but should he be a 1.22 minus 454 implied probability of 82% favourite over Kevin Borjas in his UFC debut? Like, this is one of those strange cards where you've got so many fighters who undoubtedly are more likely to win, but their odds are in the extreme favourite range, which makes their implied probabilities absurd. You know, this is one of those strange cards where I think we've got 12 heavy favourites out of the 13 fights, and many of those big favourites deserve to be favourites, but the odds are just absurdly wide. It's absolutely crazy. So, this is one of those matchups where, you know, Rodriguez is making his UFC debut. He's Mexican, so perhaps the high altitude climate in Mexico City won't affect him as much as it might maybe affect Kevin Borjas. And this isn't a bad stylistic matchup for Rodriguez. He showed his toughness on the UFC, on the UFC's Ultimate Fighter show, where, you know, he was involved in a tough 3-round war with Joseph Morales, who's obviously a decent level UFC fighter. It's very, very competitive with Morales. It's the reason why, even though he lost on the Ultimate Fighter, he's still been given a contract. He's decent. And this is a classic striker versus grappler matchup. Rodriguez is, you know, a well-rounded guy, but for the most part, he's more of a grappler than a striker. And Kevin Borjas, very, very good kickboxer, good counter striker, you know, decent, solid technical striking. So this is a tough fight for Kevin Borjas because he has been known to slow down as fights wear on. And with this fight being at high altitude, that's really going to test his cardio. And if Borjas is someone that usually slows down at sea level, when he now faces a tough Mexican like Rodriguez that can fight at a high pace in Mexico City, he's likely to fade even harder than usual. And one big weapon that Rodriguez has got that he can use to cause Borjas big problems is his offensive wrestling. You know, Rodriguez, even though he's Mexican and we associate, you know, most Mexican fighters as being strikers, Rodriguez is more of a grappler. And whilst he's not the most physically imposing grappler, he is quite persistent with his grappling. He doesn't have the heaviest top game and the heaviest grappling control, but he is a persistent grappler with a good enough gas tank to go hard for 3 rounds. And this is obviously a great weapon that he can use to wear Borjas down. You know, Borjas doesn't have terrible takedown defense, but he will give up a lot of cheap takedowns. And the problem with Borjas is obviously every time he gets taken down, he's got to exert a ton of energy to get back up to his feet. And Rodriguez is one of those persistent guys that will keep repeatedly trying to take you down. So this is one of those matchups where it is a good fight for Rodriguez, even though Borjas technically has a huge advantage when it comes to striking. Borjas is more of a volume striker. He doesn't really have that knockout power. If you look at his record, you know, he's a bit of a decisionator. Very technical, but he kind of chips away at you with a high volume of strikes. And so even though Rodriguez isn't the best on the feet, he is a tough Mexican, and so with Borjas really not having that threat of a flash knockout with big power, Rodriguez is probably going to be able to survive on the feet just fine and be able to win this fight, you know, with takedowns, top control, wet blanketing Borjas up against the cage, stuff like that. So it's a good stylistic matchup for Rodriguez. I understand why he's a favourite. I understand why he's most likely to win. The issue I have is, again, like with so many fights on this card, the odds just feel a bit absurd, and Borjas definitely being disrespected here, especially with this being Imanol Rodriguez's UFC debut. Yeah, you can see both guys about the same age, about the same size. Borjas, nice 4-inch reach advantage, but if he's on his back and spending most of the fight defending takedowns, a 4-inch reach advantage ain't really going to help you. So yeah, hope you found that useful. Let's move on to the next one. Now let's break down the fight between Santiago Luna and Angel Pacheco, and you can probably tell from the odds what I'm already about to say. Yes, the odds feel extremely wide on this fight, but Angel Pacheco, out of all the fighters in this odds range this weekend, is probably the livest underdog. You know, when you compare him to guys like Jose Medina, Chris Matinho, and Eric Silva, who are all in that kind of similar odds range at an implied probability of around 18 to 20%. Pacheco is the only one out of all those fighters that I look at and I strongly consider betting. And I might bet Pacheco this weekend. There's no doubt that Luna is most likely to win, but the odds are just absurd here. And if you can just give Pacheco a 1 in 4 chance, a 25% chance of winning this fight, you can get a really good margin of value in the odds. It is absurd that Luna is a 1.15 minus 660 implied probability of 87% favourite. It's just completely absurd. And so whilst Pacheco is most likely to lose this, the odds feel Disneyland wide here. This is Fantasyland. This is absurd. So whenever you are going to be betting on a big underdog like Pacheco, you have to accept that there's going to be major risk factors with them, and you know they're more likely to lose. If they were more likely to win, they wouldn't be such big underdogs, right? They wouldn't be such big underdogs. I think the dog has just stolen something. Oh, sorry. My dog has just stolen something off my wife's desk. Kiko, come here. Can I have that, babe? Thank you. Can I take that? Thank you very much. Sorry, guys. Took a camera lens. Sorry about that. Let's get back to the breakdown. So, God, that threw me off. But we're going to keep going because this video is already really long. So, Pacheco is most likely to lose this. If he wasn't most likely to lose, he wouldn't be such a big underdog. And we know there are going to be risk factors whenever you bet on a guy like Pacheco. But you want to keep those risk factors at an absolute minimum. So if ever I'm considering a bet on a big underdog like Pacheco, I want to make sure I see them weigh in, make sure there's no issues with, you know, their weight cut, how they look at the weigh-ins, any potential signs of an injury or an illness around about fight time. Because, you know, just in the last few weeks, we've seen Vinicius Oliveira come out and say that he thought he was going to die cutting weight foot with a broken arm. It's going to be hard enough for Pacheco to win this weekend without him potentially having a bad weight cut or a sickness or an injury. So we want to make sure a guy like Pacheco is healthy before we pull the trigger on him. So I haven't made my mind up on this one yet, but he is a very tempting bet at this odds range, and I would urge you to go and research this fight yourself and let me know what you think about it. And the basic reason why I think Pacheco is such a interesting bet this weekend is because Lone'er is just very average. There's nothing special about him at all. He is a wrestle boxer, but striking not particularly dangerous, doesn't really have too much power in his hands, more of a volume striker. If you take a look at his record, he did knock Quang Li out, in his last fight. He's got some knockouts and stuff, but for the most part, he's more of a grappler. He's not a particularly dangerous striker, and Angel Pacheco, he is a tough fucker on the feet. Lone'er is more of a grappler than a striker. He doesn't shoot a super high volume of takedowns, but he does prefer to grapple. He's a little bit awkward and uncomfortable on the feet. Pacheco, the one issue I do have with Pacheco is whilst he's not the easiest to hold down, he does give up a lot of cheap takedowns. So for a persistent grappler like Lone'er, who has the cardio to shoot takedowns for the full 15 minutes, it is going to be difficult for Pacheco to keep the fight standing for long enough to maybe land some shots and outstrike Lone'er, and that's Pacheco's main path to victory here. But having said that, we also haven't seen Pacheco for around 2 years now. So it's possible that he could have made big improvements since we last saw him. I mean, if you look at the fighter comparison tool, he is 34 years old. So he is at that stage in his career where you wouldn't really expect him to be improving that much because, he's obviously in a stage of his career where he's plateauing. But the fact that he hasn't fought for 2 years, he could look a lot better than he did when we last saw him. And personally, I think that Cowlin Loughran and Danny Silva are much better fighters than Santiago Luna and much tougher challenges than Santiago Luna as well. So it's a very interesting matchup. Pacheco live as hell here, and I would definitely prefer to have my money on Pacheco than I would Luna. I just want to see how he weighs in, give it some more thought, maybe research it a second time, and then I'll let you know what I'm doing. If you're on my website, if you're a member of my community, obviously I'll send you an email if I'm going to bet Pacheco. You'll get automated emails. Yeah, maybe we will be pulling the trigger on Pacheco this weekend. So let me know what you think. It's one of those fights where, yes, Pacheco's more likely to lose, but if you just play the odds, play the percentages, he definitely has a better than 18% chance of winning. So you have to put your money in a lot of danger if you bet a guy like Pacheco, but there's no way in this universe Luna should be an 87% implied probability favourite. That's absolutely absurd. So I hope you found that useful. Let's move on to the next one. Now let's break down the fight between Edgar Chairez and Felipe Bunes. So another big favourite, another pretty dead fight for betting. Chairez a 1.29 favourite, which is going to be minus 347 for an implied probability of 78%. If you take a look at the odds on Bunes, he's a 3.65 underdog, which is plus 265 for an implied probability of 27%. So another fight where the odds feel very wide. Say all the stuff I've said in the other videos. This card is very annoying because 12 heavy favourites out of 13 fights. You've got a bunch of relatively low-level fighters as big favourites, which always spells a recipe for disaster. Chairez is more likely to win. He's got home advantage. He's fought in Mexico City at high altitude before. Bunes is a low-level guy. We all know Chairez is more likely to win. But again, the odds feel just very, very, very wide. And I don't really understand why Chairez has an implied probability of 78% attached to him. But there we are. The one good thing about this fight is that both these guys have spent a little bit more time in the octagon than a lot of the other fighters on this card we've broken down so far. So the stats can be brought into play a little bit here. Obviously, Bunes has only had 3 fights, which isn't a huge amount of fights. Chairez, a few more. He's had 5. But at least we're not dealing with debutants or guys that have just only had 1 or 2 fights in the UFC so far, which has been the case with pretty much everyone that we've broken down so far, which has made this pretty tricky card to research and break down. But if we look at the stats on this one, we can see that Bunes getting pretty old for 36 years old. Both of them are about the same size, and in terms of the stats, you can see Bunes slightly more volume per minute on the feet, but Chairez has big abnormal power for the division, which somewhat offsets the higher activity that Bunes is bringing to the table. Bunes a little bit more accurate. We can see Chairez and Bunes about the same defensively. Bunes more likely to get this fight to the ground, although Chairez is the better grappler out of the two, so that probably won't matter a whole lot. And Chairez, very, very bad takedown defense, but he is better than Bunes on the ground, and I don't think Bunes wants to be on the ground with him here. And you can see both guys mix it up, go into the legs and the body, an above average amount of the time, which is very, very nice. But not too much separating them on the stats, to be fair. So obviously it's not going to be easy for Bunes, who's Brazilian, to go to Mexico, beat a Mexican in Mexico. But Chairez has a lot of weaknesses. He does have a tendency to slow down as the fights wear on. You've just seen that he's got 33% takedown offense. He is quite easy to take down. You can tire him out quite quickly if you force him to grapple. One of the main reasons why he does slow his fights wear on is because he's got big abnormal power in his hands, and that power comes at a cost, which is why his gas tank fades pretty quickly if you do force him, you know, into these big grappling exchanges, which we've seen him engage in some fights. But he is quite strong and physically imposing on the ground. He does have a tricky submission game. He is the better grappler than Bunes, there's no doubt about it. On the feet, Bunes has the volume, Chairez has the power, but Chairez's abnormal power does cause a lot of guys problems. So he's one of those guys that hits so hard that when he lands clean and hard on you, his opponents have got kind of like a crazy look in their eyes, like they can't believe he hits that hard. He actually landed some big shots on Joshua Van and hurt him a couple times when they fought, and we've all seen what Van's gone on to do. He's the current champ. So yeah, Chairez should win this, but the odds are very wide. He slows down his fights wear on. He's a bit sloppy on the feet. His takedown offense isn't the best. He probably, you know, outstrikes and out-hustles Bunes on the ground and wins, because Bunes isn't really a finisher. If you take a look at his record, you know, for the most part, he goes to a decision quite frequently. Whenever he has got finishes, it's been against a pretty low level of opponent. And, you know, in order for Bunes to win the decision against Chairez in Mexico, he's going to have to win 2 rounds out of the 3 decisively, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. So yeah, very, very difficult fight for Mr. Bunes. He will probably lose, but the odds are very, very wide. If you do want to bet this fight, it is dog or pass. You have to take Felipe Bunes, but just know he will probably lose. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's move on to the next one. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Daniel Zellhuber versus King Bobby Green. Yet another big favourite. Yet another big favourite. Oh my god. I guess the only thing that's really different about the Zellhuber versus Bobby Green fight is Zellhuber is one of the very few fighters on this card that is a big favourite, that I do think justifies his price tag. And I'll get into the reasons why as we move through this breakdown. But yeah, Zellhuber is one of the only guys out of the 12 big favourites on this card that I look at it and I go, you know what, that kind of makes sense. Because we know a lot about both Zellhuber and Green. There aren't really any unanswered questions about them. There's tons of footage on both guys. We've seen both guys in lots of different positions against a wide range of opponents. So this is one of those examples of where you can kind of justify odds of big favourite odds because there's so much information available to us. So Zellhuber's a 1.19 favourite, which is minus 513 for an implied probability of 84%. And Bobby Green, 4.69 underdog, which is plus 369 for an implied probability of 21%. So if we take a look at the stats on this one, this is again one of the few fights where the stats are actually meaningful because both guys have spent so much time in the octagon. They've generated a good amount of data for us to work with. So let's take a look at the stats because we haven't really been able to use the stats for many of the fights on this card with there being so many debutants and so many guys coming in who've only had 1, 2, maybe 3 fights maximum. So we can see that Zellhuber is 13 years younger than Bobby Green, which gives him around about a 70% chance of winning this. We know the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there is a 13-year age gap in a fight. And obviously at this stage in their careers, 39 years old, very old for a lightweight. We know Bobby Green is going to be getting worse and worse from fight to fight, whereas Zel Huba, 26 years old, should be getting better and better from fight to fight. I wouldn't say we've necessarily seen a whole lot of improvement from Zel Huba over the last sort of year or two, but to be fair, he was very good to begin with, and as a result, maybe he's just plateauing a little bit. Maybe he was a sponge earlier in his career, and now his rate of improvement has slowed a bit. You can see, though, that age isn't the only advantage Zel Huba has here in terms of the physical stats. He's also 3 inches taller and has a massive 6-inch reach advantage, which is huge because he knows how to use it. And Bobby Green is the kind of guy that does tend to want to fight you in boxing range and does want to tend to fight you in close. So that 6-inch reach advantage compounding with a 3-inch height advantage, that's absolutely huge for Zel Huba. Now, if we take a look at the stats, we can see that both of them land a very high volume of strikes per minute, but it is worth noting that the 6-inch reach advantage, 3-inch height advantage for Zel Huba will make it far harder for Bobby Green to get inside and land, because Zel Huba uses his length well, and he can chip away at Bobby Green from a range where Bobby Green really has to bite down on the mouthpiece, work his way inside to get inside and land. Also, with Bobby Green being under the Zuffa banner for, over 10 years at this point, these stats are obviously cumulative across his entire career. So he probably doesn't land an average of 6.4 strikes per minute now in 2026 at the age of 39. But this is obviously an average from across his entire career, where he probably would have been more aggressive, more active earlier in his career. He's also more accurate than Zel Huba, but again, remember that size advantage, that 6-inch reach differential will make it much harder for Bobby Green to get inside and land. Now, Green is great defensively. We know that even at 39, his reflexes are still good, still does a good job of reading his opponents, slipping shots, rolling with the punches. Very, very good defensively. Impressive at Bobby's age that he is still this good defensively. Neither of these guys ever really go for takedowns, so the takedown defense stats, takedown submissions, it's all a little bit irrelevant. The strike distribution data for Bobby Green isn't generating, but we know that he's very much a headhunter, and his main weapon is throwing straights and jabs to the head. Very high percentage of Bobby's strikes land to the head. Same goes for Zel Huba, mixes it up a bit to the body, but for the most part, he's very much a headhunter as well. So we were talking about this being a good fight for Zel Huba and him being one of the only big favourites on this card to justify his price tag. So why is that? Well, straight away we can see the Mexican flag. We know that Mexican fighters are going to have a big advantage in this card, and in order to beat Mexican fighters with home advantage in Mexico City, you're going to need to either finish them, which is not very likely for Bobby Green, because Bobby Green's always been a volume striker. He's not the most dangerous. He's not a finisher. If you look at his record and look at his wins, you can see, decision win over Jim Miller. He did knock out Grant Dawson with a flash KO early, but obviously Dawson very bad defensively, very low level striker compared to Zel Huba. He got a very late submission with 6 seconds left to go against Tony Ferguson. Prior to that, decision against Hack Karast. Flash KO against Ally Quinta, 3 decisions here. The guy, for the most part, is just a big, fat, old decisionator. Not really dangerous on the feet, more of a volume striker. And we know Zel Huba is very tough, very durable, granite chin. We have seen him rocked in fights. We have seen him hurt in his fights against both Michael Johnson and Esteban Ribovic in his last 2. But he is tough as nails, durable, and even when he gets hurt, he's able to recover quickly, bounce back quickly. So even if Bobby Green were to ding him, catch him with a big shot and rock him, very, very confident that Zel Huba would be able to find a way to recover and fight his way back in to the matchup. And so in order for Green to win this, he's going to need to either finish Zel Huba inside the distance, which will be very difficult because he doesn't have knockout power. We've just described how tough Zel Huba is, and it's also not going to be difficult for him, not going to be easy for him to outpoint him, because we know Zel Huba, fights at a high pace, lands a high volume of strikes, is much bigger, much longer than Green. That size advantage will make it harder for Green to get inside and land his shots. And we know that in order to beat Zel Huba in 2 out of 3 rounds decisively, Green is going to have to win, by a very big margin. Because if these rounds are anywhere near close and competitive, the judges are probably going to give Zel Huba the nod and probably going to score rounds in favour of the home fighter. So this is one of those guys that I do think is pretty safe to throw into your parlays. I think he's the safest bet on the card. If you said to me right now, Chris, you have to select a champion, Game of Thrones style, to fight for you this weekend. You have to pick one guy. Your life depends on it. If he loses, you're screwed. You're dead. We're going to kill you. Pick one guy out of anyone on this card to fight for your life. I would pick Zel Huba over Bobby Green. I think he's the safest bet on the card. I think he wins a very high percentage of the time, just because Green's not dangerous on the ground, doesn't really have knockout power. He's old, he's smaller than Zel Huba, can't match Zel Huba's volume. Home advantage is the cherry on top of the cake. I'd be amazed if Zel Huba loses this. So I think you're free to throw him into your parlays. I'm personally going to be parlaying him with Brandon Moreno. We'll talk about Moreno in a moment. So yeah, Zel Huba should win, and I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Marlon Vera versus David Martinez. So again, like a broken record, odds very wide on this one, and I don't really understand why Martinez is at an implied probability of 75%. It's just a silly card. So hopefully we're going to be able to make some money live betting this card, because whenever you've got a lot of fights where the odds do feel very wide, like this one, 12 fights out of the 13 feature very heavy favourites, most of them pretty low level or have major weaknesses, the odds feeling wide. That's usually the very perfect storm we need to make good profits live betting. So hopefully we can have a big night in live betting. From a pre-fight betting point of view, so many of these fights are absolutely dead. So Martinez 1.34 favourite, which is going to be minus 294 for an implied probability of 75%. Vera 3.28 underdog, which is plus 228 for an implied probability of 31%. So if we bring up the fighter comparison tool, it's not super useful for Martinez because he's only had 3 fights under the Zuffa banner, but 2 of them did go to a decision. So he has spent a meaningful amount of time in the octagon. So if we look at the fighter comparison, we can see that Martinez is 6 years younger, but not a major issue in a fight like this, because it's not like Marlon Vera is crazy old or anything like that. You can see Marlon Vera 3 inches taller, 3-inch reach advantage, 3-inch leg reach advantage. So those individual size advantages all compound together, which is very nice. In terms of the stats, Martinez lands 26.5% more strikes per minute, but Vera has obviously fought a much higher level of opponent throughout his career, and so naturally that average will be higher for Martinez because he's fought a lower level. If Martinez would have faced the kind of guys Vera's faced in his career, it's very possible Vera may land more strikes per minute. We can see they're about the same in terms of accuracy. Martinez much better defensively, but again, he has fought a much lower level of opponent. Whether his defense would be 67% if he fought the same guys as Marlon Vera, guys like, Corey Sandhagen as an example, I highly, highly doubt it. As you can see, neither guy ever really tries to take their opponents down, so I doubt the takedown defense and submissions will really matter. This should be a stand-up fight. Both guys are predominantly strikers, and in terms of strike distribution chart, you can see Marlon Vera very much targets the legs and the body, and that is mainly because he has a kicks-based style of striking, throws a lot of kicks, and isn't really too much of a boxer, whereas you can see Martinez more of a boxer, more of a headhunter. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, Marlon Vera has 2 major weaknesses that have been costing him a lot over the last few years, and most likely outcome is that they will cost him again this weekend, because Martinez is quite well positioned to exploit both those weaknesses. In fact, there's kind of 3 weaknesses, and we've alluded to one already. So the first weakness Marlon Vera has is that he's very passive, struggles to pull the trigger, does a whole lot of nothing for the vast majority of his fights. Now, we can all remember times throughout Marlon Vera's career where he's been, crazy aggressive and he's been involved in these wild wars. But those memories we have of Vera tend to be very fleeting moments in what are often otherwise very low volume performances where he does a whole lot of nothing. Vera's one of those guys that will have long periods of inactivity. In a 3-round fight, he may have one round where he really goes for it and gets really aggressive, but the majority of the other 2 rounds in the fight, he'll be very passive, very low volume, and will do a whole lot of nothing. And that's the reason why, if you take a look at Vera's record, he's just lost so many decisions. Lost decision there, decision there, decision there, decision there. And even more concerning, he's lost his last 2 fights against Figueiredo and Zahabi, who are also at times relatively low volume strikers, particularly Figueiredo at this stage in his career. So Vera is one of those guys that is very easy to point, very easy to outwork, but he's also one of those guys we know has got so much more to give. We've seen the aggressive, sequences from him. We've seen how, mean and nasty and tough and aggressive that he can be at times. We've seen how dangerous he is when he looks to take his opponent out. He does have that killer instinct, but we just haven't seen it for a long time. And when we do see it at times in fights, it doesn't last for long enough for him to actually win the fight, and he still gets outpointed. His second weakness is that he isn't a very good boxer. So you look at the strike distribution chart, lands a high volume of his strikes to the legs and to the body. He's one of those guys that isn't the best boxer, doesn't have too much power in his hands. He has nasty knees, nasty elbows, nasty kicks, but in terms of his boxing, is not that effective. So he doesn't really have much power in his hands, and for a boxer like Martinez, he's likely to have a pretty big advantage when it comes to boxing in this one. The third major issue with Vera is that he's very weak off his back. Even though he's been in the UFC for, around 10 years at this point, he's been around forever. He's one of those guys, if you take him down, put him on his back, instead of trying to get back up to his feet, he will just hunt for long shot arm bars and triangles off his back without making any effort to get back up, which is very, very, very bad in UFC, because obviously the guy on the bottom is losing most of the time. It's a losing position, and whilst that is unlikely to matter in this fight because Martinez is a pure striker that never looks to get fights to the ground, one of the reasons why Vera does lose a lot of his fights is because as soon as he does start to cause his opponent problems and put him in a little bit of trouble, all they need to do is level change, get the fight to the ground, and they can lay on top of him and grind him out and control him pretty easily. So that's always a backup plan for someone like Martinez. If Vera does show up looking more aggressive than usual and does start to have success on the feet. Now, Vera has said that he's going to be more aggressive this weekend and fight at a higher pace, and he's not going to hold back so much, and he's going to go to war with Martinez. We've heard this from Vera before, and we need to see it before we can believe it, and certainly wouldn't be making betting decisions based on things the fighters say in interviews unless they're referring to like sicknesses, injuries and things like that. But in terms of their strategies and game plans, the best proof we've got of how a fighter will perform is just looking at how they've performed in their last few fights. And based on Vera's last few fights, he's been very passive, very tentative, and if he performs like that against Martinez, he will very likely get outstruck. So I'm not going to say it's a good fight for Martinez because Vera is a tough opponent if he shows up. But Vera is a little bit like Macy Chiazon this weekend in the sense that if he shows up and fights to his full potential, if he lets his hands go, if he fights at a high pace, if he shows a bit of urgency to get back up, if he does find himself on the ground, then yeah, it's a great fight for Vera, and Martinez is in a lot of trouble. But all we can do is make the best decision possible with the information we've got available. Martinez is more aggressive than both Ayman Zahabi and Davison Figueiredo at this stage in their careers. His output is higher. So if Vera's getting outworked and outpointed against guys like Zahabi and Figueiredo, logically, he's probably going to get outworked by Martinez as well. Obviously, another issue that makes this a tough fight for Vera is that this fight's taking place in Mexico. Martinez got home advantage. So in order for Vera to win this, he'd need to finish Martinez inside the distance. And while Vera does have nasty knees, elbows, that kind of thing, he hasn't finished anyone for 3.5 years since he head kicked Dominic Cruz in round 4. You can see prior to that, lost his last 5 fights by decision, albeit he has faced a decent level of opponent. Prior to that, though, a lot of his fights were going to decisions. And when he does finish guys, it tends to be pretty late. Frankie Edgar was kind of shot. Vera was actually losing this fight when he flash KO'd Cruz. So, yeah, Martinez probably going to outwork Vera. It's not going to be easy for Vera to finish a tough Mexican like Martinez. And in order to win a decision, he's going to need to win 2 out of 3 rounds dominantly and decisively, which will be a very difficult thing to do. So I hope you found that useful. Martinez will probably win, but at these odds, you can't touch him. If you do want to bet this fight, you do have to take Vera. This is dog or pass, but I hate betting on fighters that are very passive, tentative, and do a whole lot of nothing, especially when they're fighting very high output, aggressive fighters like Martinez. So this one is an easy pass for me. Let's move on to the next one. Now let's break down the main event of this weekend's card, and I'm going to be explaining the reasons why I'm going to be betting Brandon Moreno to beat Lone'er Kavanagh as a relatively big favourite, but not as big of a favourite as so many of the fighters on this card. I mean, when you look at the odds on guys like David Martinez, Zel Huba, Chairez, Rodriguez, Lone'er, Gandra, Quinones, Reyes, Marshall, and Damian Penis, it's kind of nice to see odds in this range, because while it is very difficult to make a profit long-term betting fighters in the range that Moreno is in, at least it gives us something to think about. So many of the fights on this card have been an automatic dog or pass just due to the odds. This one between Moreno and Kavanagh, bit more interesting. So Moreno a 1.47 favourite, which is minus 213 for an implied probability of 68%, and Kavanagh a 2.70 underdog, which is going to be plus 170 for an implied probability of 37%. Both these guys have obviously spent quite a bit of time in the octagon as well, so the stats are reasonably useful for us. We can see that while both guys are, not old for the division, Brandon Moreno is definitely on a decline. He does have a lot of miles on the clock. He does have over 30 pro fights. If you go back and watch my breakdown videos from Moreno over the last sort of 2-3 years, I think this guy's been on a decline for a very long time. Started calling this out after this performance against Pantoja, where extremely bad fight IQ cost him the title. And one of those situations where I think ever since he's been on a steep decline, and he's one of those guys that I think because he's been in so many wars and because he came into the UFC in his early 20s, he's going to be declining earlier in his career than most, because, age isn't a binary number when it comes to the rate of which fighters decline in the UFC. It really comes down to how much wear and tear they put on their body. And Moreno's put a lot of wear and tear on his body. He's spent a lot of time in the octagon fighting the decisions against some of the best fighters in the world. You see all these decisions he's gone to, long, hard, 5-round wars. And, that mileage adds up. It's just like a car, right? If you've got a 10-year-old car that's only got 1,000 miles on the clock, or a 1-year-old car that's got 100,000 miles on the clock, the 10-year-old car is probably going to be more reliable than the 1-year-old car, because it's got a lot less mileage, a lot less damage. It's been through a lot less, right? So Moreno definitely on a steep decline. In terms of the size difference between these two, Moreno is a little bit longer and taller. The leg reach, the reach, and the slight height advantage will all compound together, but not a massive size difference between these two. Now, in terms of the stats, like we've said with a lot of other guys on this card, Kavanagh's stats are going to be inflated because he's fought a much lower level of opponent than Moreno, and if he fought a similar level of opponent to Moreno, I wouldn't expect his stats to be as impressive. So the stats not super meaningful in this one, but Moreno, is a very active fighter. He does throw a decent volume of strikes. He is very well rounded, although he is becoming more passive and tentative as he starts to decline. And so, just like we were saying with Bobby Green, where Bobby Green has got pretty impressive stats, I doubt that his outputs and stats in 2026 are reflective of the numbers we see in front of us, because naturally when you decline, that's going to lower your average, right? And these stats are going to be generated from when Moreno, was in his prime, and those small number of fights over the last 2-3 years when he started to decline won't really show up very clearly in these stats, because they're just an average. So important to understand that. In terms of the strike distribution chart, Kavanagh mixes it up a lot to the legs and the body, and you can see Moreno very much a headhunter. Vast majority of his strikes, 84%, are to the head, which, is quite interesting in a fight like this, because it's much easier to win stand-up fights punching your opponent in the face than it is kicking him in the legs and the body. So, the fact that Moreno goes to the head a lot more than Kavanagh could be an advantage in Moreno's favour this weekend. Before we get into how these two match up stylistically, though, what we want to do is point out the real reason why I'm betting Moreno this weekend, and the main reason, I should say, why I'm betting Moreno this weekend. It's going to be extremely difficult for Lone'er Kavanagh to go to Mexico, fight at high altitude on short notice when he's very inexperienced. He's only had 3 fights in the UFC so far, and he's going to be going to Mexico and fighting an extremely popular Mexican fighter in the main event of a card in Mexico City. We know that in order for Kavanagh to win this fight, he's going to either need to finish Moreno, which is not going to be an easy thing to do, because even though Moreno ran into trouble on the ground against Tarin in his last fight, he's extremely difficult to put away on the feet. In fact, if we go back through his record, he's never been knocked out. So Moreno has never been knocked out in over 30 pro fights. Will Kavanagh be the first to do it? Maybe, but if you look at his record, you can see Kavanagh doesn't really have too much knockout power for the most part. He is a volume striking decisionator, and Moreno is a tough Mexican. There are issues with Moreno on the ground, but Kavanagh very much a striker, so that likely won't matter. And Moreno pretty good at defending himself on the ground, scrambling back up to his feet, unless he's facing absolute phenoms on the ground like an Alexandre Pantoja or Tatsuro Taira. Most of the time Moreno's good at defending himself in grappling positions. It's just those elite top tier grapplers like Taira, like Pantoja, that he's run into trouble. But Kavanagh obviously isn't on the level of those guys on the ground. So the reason why I like Moreno in this matchup is because he has tons of experience fighting in Mexico City. The altitude won't bother him at all. It'll be business as usual. We know even in Moreno's decline, he can still fight at a decent pace for 5 rounds without slowing down. Whereas this will be very difficult for Kavanagh. He's inexperienced. He's only had 10 pro fights. Now he's going to go fight at a high altitude against a popular Mexican who fights at a high pace, who will have the crowd behind him. And so if Kavanagh can't finish Moreno inside the distance, we've already spoken about how unlikely that is, with Kavanagh being for the most part a volume striker. The only way he's going to beat Moreno is if he outworks him in 3 out of 5 rounds. And unless Moreno totally implodes, which is possible because his fight IQ, game planning, strategy isn't great at times, but this is Moreno's fight to lose, and the probability of Kavanagh outworking Moreno in 3 out of 5 rounds by a big enough margin to win 3 rounds beyond all reasonable doubt and get 3 Mexican judges to score a main event fight for him against a very, very popular Mexican fighter. I mean, it's just very, 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 very unlikely. And that's the reason why I am happy to bet Moreno at big favourite odds here. He is on a decline, there's no doubt about it. But the probability of Kavanagh going to Mexico City on short notice with only 10 pro fights and getting three judges to give him, 3 out of 5 rounds, write his name on paper, write the scores down on paper next to his name. It's just so unlikely, man. We know home advantage is a big deal in the UFC. We know hometown bias judging is a big thing. It's going to be a big thing in Mexico, and Moreno is very, very likely to win this weekend. So in terms of how they match up from a stylistic point of view, this one of those matchups where Kavanagh is, he's reasonably technical. He does move well. I think he will be competitive with Moreno early. I don't see a huge skill gap between these two early. I think it'll be very close, very competitive in the first couple of rounds. But as we tick into the 3rd, 4th and 5th, I think that altitude will start to take its toll on Kavanagh. And then he'll start to become a little bit sloppy, like we've seen him become in the second half of his fights in the UFC so far. That's when I think Moreno can start to get behind his jab, get behind his boxing, and chip away at Kavanagh. My big issue with Moreno at the moment, and one of the biggest, red flags with him and indicators that he's on a steep decline, is that in the past Moreno was very aggressive and would fight at a high pace. Now we get long periods of inactivity from him at times, but hopefully he'll feed off the energy of the crowd and he'll put a good pace on Kavanagh. And if he does, I think he'll win a very, very good percentage of the time. I think as long as Moreno can keep 3 of the 5 rounds close, that'll be enough to win a decision. I don't think Moreno needs to look great. I don't think he needs to dominate. I don't think he needs to perform even particularly well. I think if he can just keep the stand up reasonably competitive, avoid being taken down and spending a long time on the bottom, I think that'll be enough to get his hand raised. And so I do like him at 1.47 odds, minus 213 for an implied probability of 68%. And I'm going to be parlaying him, putting him into an accumulator with Mr. Zel Huba. I'd be very surprised if either Zel Huba or Moreno were to lose this weekend. They've got decent stylistic matchups in front of them. They've got experience fighting in Mexico City. Cherry on top of the cake is home advantage. So hopefully they will come through for us. I hope you found that useful. If you did, please hit the like button below. As soon as we get 100 likes, we will drop our UFC 326 breakdown video with some very, very good value bets in it. And yeah, check out my website, MMABettingTips.com. Hopefully we can make some money this weekend. Have a great time watching these fights. Love you all. See you all very soon. Hope to see you in the chat room. Hope to see you slide by the community. Nice one, guys. Take care. Bye.